Brigham Young is a little bit dispensable. He's the fall guy.
Or what if we don't get Brigham?
Then maybe the church fails.
Dr. Dan Peterson,
PhD and Emeritus Professor of Islamic Studies.
Both famous and infamous on the internet.
This is the guy. This is the Sigma.
What box have we put Brigham Young in? And is that where the friction's coming from?
Well, we have this image of Brigham as authoritarian, strong personality. When people say flawed, they're often saying really flawed. It is really wrong to look at a person from that previous generation and judge them as if they've had my advantages. It makes us comfortable because we cut people down who maybe are worthy of emulation in lots of ways. People say prophets should transcend their time. Well, in part, but not totally. Nobody ever escapes the time and culture in which he or she was raised. He was absolutely devoted to the cause of building up Zion.
This topic of Brigham Young has been, what it would be like racism.
He was an autocrat, he was authoritarian, he was a sexist.
And some people might even say, why would God choose somebody that would choose to do that? What would you say to that person?
Well, I'd say for one thing, maybe because there's so much information available now, we've come to where we don't trust any institution, we don't trust any leader. There's always something behind the scenes that if we only knew it, and we're positive it's there anyway, even if we don't know it, this leader's got to, feet of clay. He's really a hypocrite, or he's really in it for the money, or he's been lying to us. It's I think a kind of disease that's afflicting our culture right now, where we don't like the idea of heroes. Heroes are always, if you learn the real truth about them, they'd be, well, I don't think that's true. I think it is true that if you learn about them, yeah, you'll find that they had human traits and so on. But I think there really are heroes.
So so we've kind of losing that
I think
side
we are.
of it.
And it's a sad thing. It's not good for society to have no heroes, no idealism, to be cynical all the time, not being willing to commit yourself to a cause because, it's really hypocritical, or, but there have been great causes, and that's how history is made, by people, their devotion to great causes. They're following great leaders. I mean, there's even been a thing recently where someone has said, well, the real villain in World War II is Winston Churchill. I think, no, it's not Winston Churchill, it's Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, people like that. I mean, come on. Did Churchill have his flaws? Yeah. But my feeling is he may have been raised up by the Lord to do what he did at the time he did, The Lord uses flawed people. He doesn't have much alternative.
So let's talk about this word flawed. Like, what does that really mean?
Well, when people say flawed, I think in the case of Brigham Young, for example, they're often saying really flawed. They don't mean, oh yeah, he had some imperfections. Well, that's a trivial statement. Everyone does. The critics, Brigham Young, everybody else. There's no one out there without flaws. But when they say he was flawed, I think they're often saying, well, he was uniquely flawed. He was exceptionally flawed. And I don't grant that. I don't think the historical record shows that. But it's become a way for the average man in the street to say, well, he's no better than I am, And in a way, it makes us comfortable because we cut people down who maybe they're really worthy of emulation in lots of ways. Now, if you look really carefully, do they have problems? Yeah, I mean, there's a saying, I don't remember who it goes back to, that says, no man is a hero to his valet. The guy that carries his luggage around, packs his clothes, and he sees him, as an ordinary human. But then someone responded to that and said, well, that's not because there aren't any heroes. That's because valets are valets. They're guys who pack luggage and so on, but they're missing the fact that this guy really is a great person. For all his flaws, he's a great person. If your only view of him is packing his luggage and carrying him around and preparing his aftershave, then yeah, he's like anybody else. But there's a difference, and it's not a clear line, but people can rise to be heroes on occasion and not be at other occasions. I think of someone like the character Oskar Schindler in Schindler's List. He was a bad man in a lot of ways. Cheated on his wife. I mean, just a lot of things about him. But when the time came for him to rise up and be a hero and save hundreds of Jewish lives under the Nazis, he did. Now, how the Lord's going to judge someone like that, I don't know, and I'm glad it's not my job. But was he a hero, genuine hero? Absolutely he was. Was he in other respects not? Yeah.
Unexpected answer.
Yeah.
But very powerful in
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
We've lost sight of what it means to be a hero.
Yeah.
Almost as if there are no heroes. And now we're at this point where our expectations so high that we don't even see any different. But you're saying that there's many cases of people who have had flaws that have actually done significant things.
Yeah, that rise up to do amazing things. And could you see them as ordinary humans in other regards? Yeah. But that doesn't take away from the fact. In fact, maybe that even makes more impressive the fact that they rose up and did amazing things. You know, the person who doesn't seem very distinguished but becomes heroic in a battle and saves the lives of many of his companions. You don't take away from that by saying, well, he was an ordinary farm boy. Well, yeah, that's what makes it so spectacular. We didn't expect it.
But isn't that all the superheroes?
Yeah.
They're just like Peter Parker was just this regular kid.
That's right.
And deep down we watch it and we're like, man, I want to do something significant.
Yeah.
Even I can.
And yet in real life, we often tend to cut people like that down. And I think that's a flaw in our culture right now. Because I think we ought to recognize there are great lives. There are people who lived greatly. Maybe not in every regard. Yeah, they brushed their teeth every morning like ordinary people did. And maybe they hated broccoli or who knows. None of that's the really crucial thing about them. The crucial thing is one thing or array of things that they did that make them great and worthy of study and worthy of emulation. And but our culture right now seems to not like that. You know, we want to be cynical about every institution, every leader.
Why? Why though?
You know, is there?
I mean, meaning if you've looked at history, what is there a pattern of cycle? You know what I mean? Is this at the peak of it? Has it gone away and come back before?
It has been there before. There's a wonderful story out of ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, they had the practice apparently every year, anyway, at a regular interval, of banishing somebody from the city. They didn't have to state a reason; just banish him from Athens. And one year, the fellow who was thrown out was a guy named Aristides. Aristides the Just, he was called. Well, you know, most people didn't know what he looked like. I mean, the town was big enough that you didn't run into people all the time. And so Aristides finds out that he's been banished, and he asks one guy who had cast his ballot to banish Aristides. And he says, why? And he says, I'm so sick of hearing him called Aristides the Just. That was his only reason. Throw him out of the city because everybody thinks he's a really just man, and I'm sick of it, you know, because I think envy, maybe. He's a better man than I am. He's got a reputation for being really honest and just, and I'm just sick of it. I don't want to be reminded every day of my life that I'm not the just. You know, I'm just a schmo. So there may be part of that, our envy, that we don't want to see anybody as really great because, well, I'm not. But I think we ought to see it differently than that. Here's somebody who's really great, but he's ordinary in a lot of ways. I could be that too, maybe in a different way. But I could aspire to be great and to do something really good, rather than cutting down everyone to my level, trying to rise to the level of those exceptional people who do great and good things.
Well, are you saying that maybe perhaps in this day and age, it's just like with Mormon when he's looking upon the people and he's like, miracles have ceased to be. There's no faith in the land.
Yeah.
And maybe that gap is what's causing us to be a little bit more critical. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We don't believe that could happen for us. Why could it even be for them?
And yet I think it can. I mean, I know lots of stories of ordinary people who have done amazing things. Maybe not famous things, but you know, in my own circles growing up, I knew of a man, a friend of my parents, who was in several ways not a very good guy. But there was one occasion when he rose up and just was amazing. And again, I think, okay, I don't know how to judge someone like that. He wasn't a good man, but for a while at least, in certain circumstances, he was, I consider, on his ordinary level, a great man. And I think everybody has that within him or her to do. Even if it doesn't become famous, even if it doesn't make the history books, to be an ordinary person who cares really heroically for children, or, you know, does something really great in the neighborhood. And it can be any number of things. But to say, well, I'm just a I'm just a low life. That's the way I am. That's the way everybody is. So I don't have to aspire to ever do anything. That's defeatism, and it's bad for a culture and bad for a society.
So there is a need for people to step up, for God to use people to do things,
Yeah.
for God to take an ordinary person to do something that matters forever.
Yeah.
And in that process, there's going to be some challenges, I think that it's fair to say.
Well, I think of a lot of the early leaders of the church. I mean, Joseph Smith, it's a comically common name. I didn't realize, I'd always heard, well, Smith is really common,
really is,
you know,
yeah.
but you look up a map. I saw a map the other day, and Smith is either the most common name in all of the, well, not all of the 50 states, but in all but one or two. It's one of the top three. And so Joseph Smith, well, okay. Farm boy, uneducated. What can ever come of that? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth, right?
Yeah.
You know, the idea is no. Well, actually, really good things can come out of Nazareth, and really great things can come out of Palmyra or Vermont, wherever you think Joseph came from. But likewise, Wilford Woodruff, he was a fisherman, he was a craftsman. Heber C. Kimball was a potter. Brigham Young was a painter, glazier, and carpenter. And had the gospel not come along and demanded something of them, made something of them, they probably would have gone down, not in history, they wouldn't have been remembered, but as painters, glaziers, coopers, just ordinary workers who didn't do anything. But when the challenge came, they rose to it. And I won't say that everybody is capable of what a Brigham Young or Wilford Woodruff or Heber C. Kimball or a Joseph Smith did, but everybody is capable of being more than just nothing. And I think democracy can feed mediocrity too. It allows people to excel, ordinary people, but it can also make us think, well, I'm just as good as the next guy and he's no good, so I don't have to be any good. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that does. Well, I mean, it's just like, again, back to that idea of we almost project ourselves onto other people.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I think that happens.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Brigham Young specifically, if we can just transition into that, what do you think it is about our time that it's caused him to be such a lightning rod? You know, or even just the idea of, because it hasn't always been the case that way, right?
No. When I grew up marginally in the church. My father wasn't a member when I was growing up. My mother was semi-active, but still I heard a lot about Brigham Young. My mother had been born and raised in Utah, so Brigham Young was a major factor in her life. I mean, she grew up in St. George. He dedicated that temple there, and so they knew about Brigham. There were stories about Brigham. And so I grew up with the idea that Brigham was the colonizing genius, the organizer, the great practical man of affairs, and so on. I don't think that I heard much about him being a prophet or a spiritual leader. That's one of the gaps I want to remedy with the projects we're working on. But he was admired in a way. He was considered tough. He was a great leader, a bit authoritarian, but that's what the Lord needed. That's what the settlement of the West needed. Probably true. But he wasn't attacked. And now I see him being attacked in the last 10 years or so.
So 10 years, you'd say?
Yeah, it's something like that. I can't give a precise figure, but it seems to me that one of the things that's happening is that people who want to be Latter-day Saints, but who don't like certain aspects of the church, want to blame that on Brigham. It wasn't Joseph. Joseph's beyond reproach to them. But Brigham, if there's oppression of women in the church, that's Brigham's fault. Plural marriage. If I don't like plural marriage, well, Brigham Young did that. If I don't like the church's racial policies for a long time, that's Brigham Young's fault. And
so that it moves from Joseph.
Yeah.
Why does that matter, though?
Because people want to preserve Joseph. He's the beginning of the tradition. But Brigham Young is a little bit dispensable. I would argue he's not, actually.
He's the fall guy?
He's the fall guy. Everything is blamed on him. And so if you don't like something, it's Brigham's fault. Joseph would never have done that. And that's just not true in a lot of these cases. Things that Brigham is blamed for actually do go back in some way to Joseph. Some don't. We're not clear on where they come from. But yeah, plural marriage, for example. The Interpretive Foundation published an article a few months ago about Section 132. Now, some people are claiming that Joseph never practiced or taught plural marriage. So one of their bits of evidence is they say Section 132 is a forgery. Brigham Young invented that, with some collaborators. Well, we are able to show on the basis of historical evidence, word print analysis, statistical analysis of the section, that's almost certainly impossible. It goes back to Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
It is not Brigham Young's invention or anybody else's after Joseph. It was already in circulation while Joseph was alive. And, if Section 132 goes back to Joseph, then Joseph was involved with plural marriage. There's no way out. You may not like it. I understand a lot of people don't like it. But that doesn't allow you to change history.
Yeah.
But they want to blame Brigham. Brigham did it. And there's no evidence for that. One thing that has emerged from our work on Brigham Young has been how loyal Brigham was to Joseph.
Interesting.
Joseph, whatever Joseph taught, Brigham would try to do. And there's a scene in our movie, 6 Days in August, that is, to my mind, really important. It's where Brigham and some of the other apostles go to Far West and lay the cornerstone for the temple and take their leave from there for their mission to England. Well, it had been prophesied or said by Joseph that they would take their leave for their mission to England on such and such a date at the Far West temple site. Well, that made sense when the saints were all in Missouri. But since then, they've been butchered and driven out of the state. Lilburn Boggs has issued his extermination order. Now it makes no earthly sense for Brigham and the apostles to go west, it's the opposite direction from England, and under the cover of darkness, basically lay the cornerstone.
Sneak in there.
But that's
Brigham.
important. That's Brigham. Brigham is saying, no, if Joseph said that's what's going to happen, it's going to happen, even at the risk of our lives. We are going to do it. People say, that's one prophecy of Joe Smith that's not going to come true.
He's like, we're going to make it happen.
One of the things Brigham does is to go by the house of a local apostate, knock on the door and say, by the way, we were here.
I know. That's the most
Yeah, I mean, it's really Brigham to do that. But he wanted people to know, we were here, we did it, that prophecy has been fulfilled. And you see that over and over again in his life where there's one scene where Joseph rebukes Brigham publicly for something. I can't remember what the issue is, but a little bit rough. And, Brigham had a strong personality. Later he's known as the Lion of the Lord, and that was with reason. This is a man who did not bend
It was with
the
reason.
knee. Yeah, I mean, he was a strong personality, and he didn't bend the knee to just anybody. So the people standing there, I can imagine, are thinking, how is Brigham going to respond to being dressed down in public by Joseph? And maybe he's going to erupt with anger or something. But no, he says, Joseph, what would you have me do? Complete submission, which I think Brigham would not have shown to just about anybody else on the planet. So this idea that Brigham would have invented doctrines, falsified things apart from Joseph, against Joseph's teachings, I cannot see him do that. I mean, when Brigham dies, his dying words, according to some reports, are Joseph, Joseph, Joseph. And I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if Joseph came to pick him up.
Maybe he saw him.
Yeah, he may have seen him. But he was devoted to him all the time. He would say, I feel like shouting hallelujah all the time when I realize how privileged I was to meet Joseph Smith, the prophet of the 19th century. That was his attitude during Joseph's life and after Joseph's life for the remainder of his time. He has a dream where he finds himself in the presence of Joseph in the spirit world, presumably, and says, Joseph, I miss you. Why can't we be together anymore? And Joseph says, well, it's got to be that way for a while. It won't last forever. But in the meantime, be strong and, tell the people to get the Spirit of the Lord. That's what'll solve their problems. But he was devoted to Joseph. Loyal, absolutely. And so one of the interviews that we did for our project on Brigham Young was with Ron Esplin, who is a premier Latter-day Saint historian.
Secession.
Yeah, and he is an expert on the succession crisis. Yeah, the 1844 succession crisis. He did an article for Interpreter, actually, that we published in a book called Joseph Smith, A Life Lived in Crescendo, which I think is the definitive statement on that issue.
That's interesting.
But Ron says, look, if you wanted to follow Joseph in 1844, after he's dead, there was only one group that was planning to carry out Joseph's program. That was the 12, led by Brigham Young. Everybody else who claimed leadership was wanting to dispense with or, devalue some aspect of what Joseph taught. not Brigham and the 12. They were going to carry out Joseph's program, even if it seemed in some ways not to make any sense. I mean, two of the principal parts of the program were finish the Nauvoo temple and administer ordinances there, and then abandon it and go west. I mean, really, one or the other makes sense, but both? But Brigham said, no, we're going to do both. In fact, it's worth mentioning, a lot of people say, well, Brigham didn't claim revelation. Yeah, he did. He didn't want to seem to rival Joseph. So he doesn't make a big deal out of it in a lot of cases. But there's one entry in his journal where he said, he put the question to the Lord, should we finish the temple? Because the pressure was building to get out, violence and all this sort of thing. Should we stay and finish it? And he said, and the answer was yes. That's all he says, but clearly he's gotten an answer from the Lord, and that's it for him.
And Brigham's the kind of guy that's going to actually do it.
And he will do it, yeah.
Why does that matter?
I think it matters that he's the kind of man who will do things. I think he saved the church in a way. Now, obviously the Lord saved the church, but had someone else come to the fore, Sidney Rigdon or someone else like that, we wouldn't have the church we have today.
We wouldn't have it.
Oh, no. Brigham and the 12 had the keys. Sidney apparently did not. What would the church be without the keys of authority to do priesthood ordinances and so on? We would have been, I think, under Sidney, a kind of odd Protestant church with an extra volume of scripture. But would we have temples? I'm not sure we would. Sidney didn't seem to be into temple building, didn't grasp the importance of temples. He certainly wasn't interested in going to the West. He ended up going to Pennsylvania. So it's important that Brigham does things, that he's a man of action. My speculation, and this may be unfair to Joseph, but I've actually thought to myself, could Joseph have led the migration westward? I'm not sure. I don't know that
different gift.
Yeah, that was not his skill set, I don't think. So when the Saints are led out of Missouri, it's Brigham who leads them, and Heber C. Kimball, his closest friend. When they go on the trek westward, it's Brigham, of course, with the 12. Brigham was a man who could make things work. He was really good at that. Brigham laughed. One of the few criticisms he ever makes of Joseph is that Joseph couldn't run a store. They set him up with the
he
Nauvoo
just would give
store.
away all this stuff.
He'd give everything away, and they had to keep helping him, bailing him out. And Brigham was, I won't say he was mean, but he was a little tougher than that.
He was more rigid.
Yeah, and
rules.
Yeah, could Joseph have led that big group out westward? I don't know. Brigham could.
Joseph is the visionary.
Yeah.
Brigham is the operations.
Yeah. He's the executor, if you will. Not to say he doesn't have visions. He does.
Yeah.
We know he did. And revelations and so on. But he had skills that Joseph didn't have, and Joseph had skills that he didn't have.
So you're thinking, what I'm understanding you're saying is, and I think this is important, that Brigham Young, and then we talked about flaws of whatever it may be. Your perspective after doing a lot of this research, one of the main things that you've come to is who else could have done it?
Yeah. I don't know if there's
his skill
anybody
set
else.
was what was needed.
Yep.
And with that skill set, though, you pick up both sides of the stick, right? And I think that might be where we get a lot of the tension from, right? Is what are some of the things that you know of, or even when did you get to the point where you're like, oh shoot, what? Brigham did what? What are those things that you know about, that you hear about, that cause people to pause when they look at the past?
Well, we have this image of Brigham as authoritarian.
Yeah.
He's a strong personality, which I think is true and was necessary. But with that comes the fact that he will sometimes rub people the wrong way, because he is strong personality and authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
And he himself would say, look, I have issues. One of them he pointed out himself was, he says, my tongue. I say things that I shouldn't have said, and of course you have scribes copying down almost every word he says. So we get a lot of that material now, and you can read some of it and say, "Whoa,
he said that."
He said that. Now I want to say a couple of things. One is that we have the words, we don't have the tone of voice or the expression on the face, and that can make a difference.
Like, give me an example.
Well, if you say, at one point, he says, and we interview Legine Carruth. This is interesting. Let me step back for just a minute. Legine is with the Church History Department in Salt Lake. She's an expert on 19th century Pittman shorthand.
Oh, yeah.
And this is remarkable because she can go back to the originals of a lot of the sermons. And she says, he's been misrepresented.
Really?
I asked her once, what's the biggest misrepresentation of Brigham Young? And she said, the Journal of Discourses. I said, really? She says, yeah. George Watt, who produced almost all of the transcriptions, for some reason, he wasn't a bad man, but for some reason, whenever he had a choice, he would look at his own shorthand notes, and when he had a choice, he would make Brigham look tougher, more autocratic.
Really?
Than the text really says. So he would say, "I am perfect in my generation." She says, "No." He said, "If I am, if I am perfect." Or he says, "Many of you have lost faith because of the toughness of the Trail West." Many of you are in that condition. He actually says, "Have many of you lost your faith? Are many of you in that condition?" And then he expresses sympathy. It's very different than what we see in the Journal of Discourses. She says, what you see is a kinder man than what is often represented. And one of the things I'm excited about in our project, the historian's office up in Salt Lake has said, look, you need to get in. A couple of our people are working on a 2-volume set of Brigham's letters to the ordinary saints. And they said you'll see a pastoral side of Brigham Young that you don't normally see. There's the tough speaker in the pulpit, maybe tougher than he really was, because I think a lot of this was with a wink or he had a sense of humor. They called him Brother Brigham. They liked him.
Yeah. The people didn't like them.
Yeah, sometimes you can tell a joke. I mean, I can say something to a friend that I've known for years, and kind of insult him, but it's in a playful way because we've known each other for 3 decades.
Yeah.
And he doesn't take it seriously. But if someone saw that in print,
there's no context.
Good grief, what a nasty thing to say to him. Well, but Brigham Young was that way. The people knew him. And he could say seemingly rough things, but maybe with a twinkle in his eye. And we lose that. We don't get that, so we misinterpret it. But he would give practical advice and so on, but he was not as tough or as rigid, I think, as many people think that he was. And I think that's one of the things that I want to get across. Yeah, I said to the historians when they suggested this that we interview these people about his pastoral letters, that's exactly what I want. Because they say, you see Brigham Young thundering from the pulpit, but then you see Brigham writing to ordinary saints who've written to him about problems, and he's really trying to help. I mean, I get a kick out of one exchange that I know of where a woman came in to see him and said, Brother Brigham, my husband is, she didn't use these words, but we would, he's verbally abusive to me. I mean, he's nasty to me. He's really rough. He said, well, give me an example. And she said, well, he told me to go to hell. What should I do? And he said, well, don't go. And I mean, there's this humorous side. I mean, he's and I think that's missed. So I don't think today's saints who don't have the advantage of hearing his voice and hearing the tone in which he's speaking, you can take a quotation out of context from him and think, oh, that's blood curdling. What a horrible man.
Well, there are some things that I think that I think people hearing this will say, well, dang, that one quote. I mean, he is, and I think that if we step back for a second, I think it's important to just reemphasize what you mentioned before about the idea that Joseph Smith, and think about it, 10 years ago, that's when the internet really started to pick up the most. No, not the most. I would say different documents, it was just more broad. You could find anything about anything, right?
Yeah.
And you had like the CES letter, and then people started to look back, oh, this happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. Yeah. And then people started to justify, is what I'm understanding.
Yeah.
Right? Where you're saying that might be why it didn't happen before that.
Right.
Right? Because, and people had this information, and if you wanted to know, you had to go to the library and get the book, right?
Yeah. And most people didn't.
And most people didn't. But at the same time, now you can see the quotes, and you're saying they might be out of context.
Yeah.
Or maybe they are in context. Yeah. Or maybe we are thinking about it in the perspective that we have today.
Yeah.
But I want to kind of maybe not change gears, but I think it is important to consider this topic of Brigham Young has been, what it would be like racism.
Yeah.
What other would you say?
Oh, sexism,
authoritarianism.
Violence,
suffering, polygamy.
Yeah.
The violence, all of those types of things. And some people might even say, like, why would God choose somebody that would choose to do that, right?
Yeah.
Those are the natural questions that come up.
Yeah.
And what would you say to that person?
Well, I'd say for one thing, Brigham Young did have that unique set of skills to save the church, get the church. Although he himself says explicitly, he says, you don't credit me for this. It was the Lord's plan, not mine. I could not have come up with it. But the Lord needed an executor, if you will, someone who would be able to follow that plan, and Brigham was the man for that. And I've seen quotations from non-Latter-day Saint scholars who said, had Brigham not been invested in Mormonism, had he not been the leader of that church, he could have become anything in the United States. He was that talented. He was an able leader and recognized as such. But he gave his life to the kingdom. But why would the Lord work with someone like that? Well, first of all, I don't grant the premise that Brigham is unusually flawed or uniquely wicked. I've heard people say, some members of the church, oh, well, the Lord can work through wicked men, and he did that with Brigham Young. I don't grant that Brigham was a wicked man. Did he have his rough edges? Yeah, sure. And especially, we're used to very well-educated leaders of the church who are very smooth in a lot of ways. I mean, they've had the benefit of good educations and worldwide experience. Brigham was a painter and glazier and carpenter from upstate New York, which was the frontier. And he was 32 before he even joined the church.
Yeah.
So
he's set.
Yeah, a lot of that frontier background is in him. And he grew up with an abusive father. I think the father was really rough on him. He said, my father used to admonish us and then beat us. Well, no, he says, actually, the beating usually came first. It was that kind of a situation. And so it was rough for him. So are there rough edges to Brigham? Yeah, but there were to most of the people he was dealing with. Remember, he wasn't dealing with a bunch of, Ivy League educated people out in Utah either. They were all frontiersmen and kind of rough around the edges.
He's a frontiersman.
Yeah,
Brigham is.
Yeah. He is. And so he's dealing with a situation that's totally unlike ours today, where everything's pretty smooth and polished, and if somebody says something a little rough, you're shocked. People were letting off with rough things all the time in the 19th century American frontiers, saying things that would make us blanch. But so I don't grant that he was a bad man. I think he had those unique skills. Why would the Lord choose him? Because I think he was able and he was receptive. He was absolutely devoted to building the kingdom of God. And that loyalty to Joseph and to the idea of the kingdom, I think, is one of the things the Lord chose him for. That he was not going to back away from it. He was going to give everything he could to building up the kingdom. And he did, remarkably.
And so I'm just thinking outside the box, right? Some people might think, well, what are some of the things what were the negative effects? So we did get the good, right? And I do agree with you. I mean, I'm just trying to represent the people who are out there, right? That might be thinking, well, at what cost, right?
Well, and there's some things that came with Brigham, some things he said that we still are trying to live down. I'll give you a really classic example, which is Brigham Young and race.
Yeah, he
said some things that, oh man, I wish he hadn't said them. I don't think that they were, revealed doctrine or anything like that, but he was in some ways a man of his time, and people say he should be a prophet. Prophets should transcend their time. Well, in part, but not totally. Nobody ever escapes the time and culture in which he or she was raised. Not completely. That person would be impossible to deal with. Who could talk to them? Even. They're on a different planet than we are.
Explain to me what you mean by that, because I think a lot of people say that phrase, like a man of his time.
Yeah.
And I think that for some people, that just shuts their brain off. Like,
right, it does.
He's a man of his time. Okay, well, cool. Does that justify it? What does that mean to you?
Well, I'll talk about the race issue, for example. Brigham did say some things that make my skin crawl a little bit. I wish he hadn't said them. But then I compare them to things that were said by other people born around the same time he was, including people that everyone admires. I gave a presentation at the Fair conference back in August, and I led off by saying, I was talking about Brigham Young and race, and Brigham Young and slavery in particular. And I said, Brigham said some things that are unfortunate and that would not be acceptable now. I said, let me give you a quotation. I gave them a long quotation about black people, how they were, they shouldn't be slaves, but, well, I don't think it even said that, but it just said they shouldn't hold leadership positions in any situation where there are whites and blacks, whites should lead, and so on and so forth. I said, that's really uncomfortable, isn't it? And I'm sure most people were saying, yeah, we don't like that, and that wouldn't be acceptable now. I said, only here, let me let you in on a secret. That isn't Brigham Young. That's Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
and because it was in the air.
Mhm.
And even abolitionists at the time would say, yeah, slavery is wrong, but, black people are not equal with whites. Well, now we look at that and think that's horrible. How could they believe that?
Mm.
But that was in the atmosphere. So don't judge Brigham Young harshly for believing what Abraham Lincoln and abolitionists thought at the same time.
Yeah.
They were people of their times. They had their limitations. And one of the benefits of studying history, to my mind, is that as you're reading about how stupid people in the past were, how funny they were, how quirky ideas, they did things that we think are wrong, and even on a shallow level, they dressed funny and their hairstyles are stupid and things like that. Well, just the light bulb should go on at some point saying, oh, wait a minute. 100 years from now, people will be looking at pictures of me and thinking, what a stupid way to dress. What an idiotic hairstyle. And why did they allow that to happen? Or why did they do that when it's so clearly wrong to us? I mean, I don't know what it'll be. It could be a tolerance of abortion. I don't know. That's one that comes readily to mind, where they'll say, that was just totally wrong. How could they not see it? I don't know how they didn't see these things in the early 19th century, but they didn't. It was the air they breathed, the water they swam in. A fish doesn't know it's swimming in water.
I just know that for me, I think that I just like to listen to people. I like to understand where people are coming from, because I understand what you're trying to say and I get it 100%. But I think that some people, they fill in the gap and they think, well, are we saying he was a man of his time, therefore slavery? Like Abraham Lincoln, the founders. Well, let's just agree that slavery wasn't right,
Yeah.
Versus almost like unintentionally, it almost gives that justification of slavery.
Right. Well,
and I understand what you're saying, but I just think I don't want to say I want to defend you on behalf of the audience. I don't think that that's what you're saying.
No, not at all. That's not what I'm saying. And in
that's
fact,
more of what I mean.
I want to correct some perception about Brigham Young that I shared until fairly recently. I had learned that Brigham Young saw a bill through the territorial legislature in Utah in 1852 that legalized slavery. And I remember thinking, oh man, that's really unfortunate. That was a blind spot of Brigham the human rather than Brigham the prophet. And I'm embarrassed by that. What are you going to do? And then some research came out, notably a book called This Abominable Slavery.
Yeah.
And it's by Legene Carruth and Paul Reeve and Christopher Rich. Totally changed my view of that situation. It turned out the 1852 bill wasn't a slave bill. It was a bill for servitude. That's what they called it. Brigham didn't want it called slavery. He went out of his way to say that he loathed slavery. He said, you cannot own human flesh. Chattel slavery is an abomination. And this bill recognized servitude. But then remember, unfree labor was accepted in the United States prior to the Civil War, widely. I mean, a lot of the leaders of the church had been indentured servants. Yeah. That's how they learned their craft. They'd be sold off basically to a carpenter for 3 years.
Like an apprenticeship to you?
Yes. But you, in a sense, belonged to that carpenter. Yeah. And you weren't free. You couldn't say, oh, I'm going to leave and go work for somebody else. No, you were bound to him. Brigham grew up with that. So did a lot of his fellow leaders. So did everybody, practically. And so what they were trying to do was recognize servitude in that sense in Utah, but not slavery. So there were important provisions. Servants, as they called them, could not pass that status on to their children. Now, in the South, you had multi-generational chattel slavery, right? In Utah, you weren't going to have that. They were required to receive a certain amount of education per year. And if they didn't get it, they had legal status to sue, to complain to a judge. And it was about 3 months of formal education a year. And that doesn't sound like much, but I'm guessing the average white kid on the 19th century frontier didn't get much more than 3 months of formal education in a given year. I mean, Joseph Smith had a total of less than 3 months.
Interesting.
And a slave could, or not a slave, a servant is the terminology they used, could, if he was being mistreated or abused, could go before a magistrate and complain about it. And there are cases where the magistrates ruled in their favor. And there were even guarantees in the law that they were entitled to a certain amount of wholesome recreation. I think that's the actual phrase that's used. I don't think you ever saw that in Alabama or Mississippi in the pre-Civil War era.
So his perspective was different.
Yeah, and so what they were trying to do was it was kind of modeled on laws in Indiana and Illinois, which were not slave states. They were trying to do what they called graduated emancipation. The idea was, okay, People move into our state and they have slaves. Well, we're not going to recognize it as slavery, but we will recognize it as servitude, which white people often are involved in too, but it's going to be limited. It's not going to last more than a generation, but it's going to die out peacefully. Because if we come in and we start telling the slave owners, look, we're just going to seize what you regard as your property, we're going to have a civil war on our hands. And in fact, they did. They were trying to avoid that war, in which no small thing, 780,000, I think, people died. It was a horrible
Interesting.
affair.
But this is interesting because I think that this is a fact that people don't realize, right?
Yeah.
There are members of the church. There are people that are joining the church, and they join the church, and they also have slaves.
Yes.
Right? And
Yeah.
so I think that to us, that's very shocking.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this bill is in a way
It's trying to
dealing with that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. For the first 5 years they arrived in the territory, their understanding was if we don't have laws about slavery, then slavery has no legal status here. We're just not going to recognize slavery. And there was actually a famous British legal case where the judge, a very eminent judge in England, had said, if there's no law regulating slavery within a British territory, then slavery does not exist. We haven't recognized it, so it can't be enforced or anything else. That was their idea in the Utah Territory. But then converts from the South began to arrive who had slaves.
That's right.
And they're looking at that and thinking, oh man, what do we do now? And they had another difficult issue, which has nothing to do with black slavery. And it's one that people don't think about. It's Indian, Native American slavery. The biggest slave trading operation in the American West was the Ute Indian tribe. They would go out and capture people from other children, especially from other tribes, and then offer them for sale. And their territory ranged for sales and recruiting, if you will, seizing people from Texas basically to California. When the Saints moved into the Utah area, they thought, oh, good, a new market. So they would come up to these Utah LDS settlers. There are at least one case, maybe two that I know of, where they would come up and say, look, I've got 2 children here, 2 little girls. I want to sell them to you. And the Saints would say, horrified, no, we don't buy children. Well, if you don't buy them, I'm going to kill them. And they'd say, well, we're not going to buy them. In one case I know of, the Indian slave trader then took one of the little girls and dashed her head against a rock and killed her. At which point, of course, the couple that he's approaching said, okay. We'll buy the other girl, to prevent her from being killed right before their eyes. But then the trouble is, once you start buying slaves, if there's demand, there will be supply, right? So you start getting more slaves. So they're saying, but we don't want to own Native American slaves. But if we don't buy them, they'll kill them. And so if we buy them, we can give them maybe a life, a better life. And so we know that Brigham bought at least one Native American slave. Now, he didn't treat her as a slave. She lived in his house, and she probably worked, helping to clean the house. She was probably a servant, but she wasn't a slave. And we know that Latter-day Saints were dealing with that issue. So I look at people who say, well, you should have simply said no. Oh, it wasn't that easy when you were on the ground facing that situation. You really want to say no, maintain your purity, and watch a little child have its head dashed against a rock?
Was that how it started?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And so they're dealing not only with the question of Southerners moving into the Utah Territory with black slaves, and there were never very many. There were probably at most 30, maybe at any given time in Utah.
I know of Green Flake, and I know of
there are a few others. Green Flake,
Hark.
Hart. What's his name?
Harkley.
And a few others. But really, in some ways, it's the Native American slavery problem that's a bigger issue for them. But I'm sorry, people are listening to this right now and they're like, say what? I've never heard that before. Well, because we don't read Utah history very much, and that hasn't been written up very much. I know I interviewed Christopher Rich, who's a lawyer, former JAG lawyer in the military now, working on a PhD in history at the University of Utah. And he said, when he first looked at the 1852 so-called slave bill, he said, I began to read it, and I thought, this is not a slave bill. Why has everybody told me it was?
I always thought it was. That's what I always thought it was.
He said, it's not. It's clearly...
It's addressing the issue of servitude.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
with what you're explaining?
Yeah, and so it will recognize servitude, but for a limited time. It's serving notice on the Southerners, for example, coming in. Okay, you can keep them as servants, but you must treat them well. We have laws regulating that. They have legal status. They can complain. They can appear before a magistrate and file a complaint against you, and we will hear it. And they're also saying, and be prepared for the end of it. We're not going to seize your property, but it's going to end. You're not going to have multi-generational slaves working on your properties. Not going to be recognized in Utah. It's an attempt to find a mediating position between abolitionism, which is let's stop slavery and so what if we have a civil war, and the other, which is let's just recognize it. They're trying to to find some middle ground, and so in that regard, Abraham Lincoln was trying to do that when he first, and Joseph Smith too. Joseph proposed, and Lincoln had the idea too, of using the sale of federal lands to buy slaves. And at that time, there were many of them just over from Africa, repatriate them, send them back to Africa. Liberia in Africa grows out of that. It was an attempt to not come in and say, we're going to violently seize your property, in which case you'll likely resist and we'll have a war. We're going to recognize your property rights, even though we think you shouldn't have them, but we're going to recognize it as a practical matter. We'll pay you with money we've derived from public land sales, so you won't have grounds to complain, and we'll end slavery. Well, it never went that far. The Civil War intervened and so on. But these were attempts, good faith attempts, I think, by people who opposed slavery but didn't want the country to fall apart in violence. And so, again, it's easy. I used to always think, well, who wouldn't be an abolitionist? Why would we oppose abolitionism where Brigham and others did? Abraham Lincoln did. Well, because they looked at people like John Brown, who launched an attack on a federal armory, and a lot of people got killed. They said, well, that's the future. If that's the way you're going to do it, it's going to be a bloodbath.
This is interesting. So you have just this theme that I'm noticing is this transformation, this change. And how would God, how would we change like that?
Yeah.
And it's easy to look back in the past, and I'm just looking at this objectively, and I'm just trying to think, how would you make that transformation? How would you make that change? And you're saying that it's way more complicated than we would ever imagine.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more at stake.
Yeah.
How would you describe what was at stake?
You could have, they were worried that Utah territory would be divided, that you'd have many churches that split north-south. It's the reason you have a Southern Baptist convention.
That's right.
They split off over slavery.
That's right.
They did not want to.
I don't think that people realize what you just said.
They don't.
The reason why there's a Southern Baptist church is because of the issue of slavery.
That's right. The North was anti-slavery, and the Southerners say, hands off. Yeah. And so the Saints looked at things like that and
what
said,
year was that happening?
Oh, it was obviously pre-Civil War. I think in the 1850s, if I'm not mistaken, early 1850s. So it's about the time the Saints are confronting this issue. Yeah. We're getting more and more slaveholders in Utah territory. We never thought we'd have this problem. But we don't want our church to split up over slavery either. We can see that it's happened, and we don't want it to happen. So let's work out something where we don't legitimize slavery, but we don't force the issue in a way that will cause the breakup of our territory, the breakup of our church, and so on, because people feel strongly about these issues. These Southerners, we look at them now and think, how could you? But they really felt strongly this was their property. They bought it fair and square, you know? And we look at it now and think, well, you're just wrong. I mean, it's immoral.
I would never do that.
No, but they'd grown up with it. And just as a matter of realism, I've said I think Abraham Lincoln was on the side of the angels when he was trying to preserve the Union without a civil war by reaching whatever compromises he could. Now, ultimately, the South wouldn't allow it, but he was trying, and I think he was on the side of the angels because ending slavery is a good thing, obviously, but losing 750,000 dead is a terrible thing, and if you can avoid it, try. Now, I don't know that it would have been that bad in Utah, but they still saw a potential for strife and collapse of the church and apostasy and all sorts of problems. So what can we do here to improve the situation of the people who are currently in bondage, make sure that it isn't passed on, that it doesn't continue, that it ends peaceably, and maintain peace among our people. Now, it wasn't at the top of Brigham's agenda because, as I say, there were never a full 100 slaves in Utah Territory, probably almost always far fewer than 50. So it's not at the top of his agenda. He's got a lot of worries, settling people and influx of pioneers and where to put them and all that kind of thing. But it's on his mind, and it's pretty clear when you listen to what he says that he is not in favor of slavery. In fact, I'll tell you a couple of stories that I think are really, really interesting. Well, maybe 3 quick ones. In one case, he actually buys a slave from his owner, and that's
Greenflake.
It's Greenflake. And he sets him up with a farm in the south end of Utah Valley. And at one point, Green comes to Brigham, whom he really likes, and he says to him, we're still struggling a bit because I've got to sell a lot of my produce to pay off my wife's former owner for her freedom. And Brigham says to him, stop paying them. You don't owe them anything. Just stop. Forget that. You owe them no debt. And that's striking to me for a man who's supposedly dedicated to slavery.
Interesting.
He doesn't feel that way. And then
you've read this?
Yeah. In a book by Amy Tanner Theriot, it's called Slavery in Zion. I think that's where I found the story about Greenflake. And if it's not there, it's in the Reeve Rich Caruth book, This Abominable Slavery.
Have you interviewed her, Amy?
I have not. No, probably should. But I read the books at about the same time. I just really got into this issue because I began reading hers first and thought, whoa, this is changing my view. I'm learning things. It changed my view in the sense that the situation was a little better than I'd thought. Because I thought, slavery in Utah, that's a huge embarrassment. And it still is in a way, but not as bad. And I began reading stories about the humane treatment of black people in Utah. Now, there were some cases of inhumane treatment too. But Brigham Young giving property to Greenflake and then telling him, you don't know the slave owners that had your wife. You don't owe them anything. You don't pay them anymore. And then there were a couple of other stories. Just before I got up to speak at FAIR, I was sitting next to Mark Ashurst McGee, who's a fairly prominent Latter-day Saints historian, and he said, have you ever heard the story? And he told me a story which I had not heard. I think I'd read the book, but it hadn't registered somehow. And I incorporated it into my talk, which I thought was really good in terms of Brigham's attitude toward black people. Both stories come from Elizabeth Kane. Elizabeth Kane was the wife of Thomas Kane, who was the friend of the Latter-day Saints, not LDS as far as we know. But he was an abolitionist. So was she, I think, but she may have had a little more traditional racist attitudes than he did. And she's talking in her letters, I believe, about her experience riding down to southern Utah with Brigham Young and his party. He would go down when he was older in the winter to southern Utah for the warmer winters and the clear air and so on. And so the Kanes came along. I think Thomas Kane was having some health issues, so Brigham said, come along. We'll go down to St. George, you'll feel better. And she's really upset by the fact that one of the drovers for Brigham Young, and it may be Isaac James, who was Jane Manning James' husband.
Or husband.
Husband, I think.
Yeah.
He had really bad arthritis or rheumatism joint problems, was in pain, jostling along those roads, non-roads, down to southern Utah. And so some of them empty out one of the wagons and put a bed in, with cushions and so on, and so he can ride there. I'm sure it was still pretty miserable, but, but she was upset that these white men would do that for a black man. It just didn't seem appropriate to her.
Really?
But then the thing that really irritates her, and this is the story that Mark told me, and I put it right into my talk because I thought it was so good. Okay, here you have this idea that Brigham Young is this racist, hates black people, so on. She comes around a corner in a house that they're staying in on their way down to St. George, and she says, there I saw Brigham Young, and he's with Isaac James, who, again, is having these joint problems. He's having a hard time getting his coat on. And there she said, I saw Brigham Young, and she calls him the Pope of the Mormons. Brigham Young, the Pope of the Mormons, helping Isaac James put his coat on. And she said, and basically she complains that James wasn't showing the proper gratitude that someone of his station should show. But I just love the scene of Brigham Young helping him on with his coat. That's a small but really human gesture.
Yeah, yeah.
And it bothered her, given her, Philadelphia, upbringing and so on, that this is just not appropriate for a white man, especially a prominent white man, to be doing something like this. Well, Brigham Young obviously didn't think there was anything improper about it at all, and I love that scene. It's so small.
There's so many stories. I mean, I don't even know of the I mean, this is a whole other topic of the race, but with Q. Walker Lewis, right? Mm-hmm. He was one of our finest elders, and I know obviously we could go in another direction if it need. But I mean, there was something in that where some of the perspectives that you're saying that you had, it was different.
Yeah. And so, it opened up my mind to realize, no, Brigham was not pro-slavery. He was not, was he a racist by my standards, the early 21st century? Yes, but so was Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. So were a lot of the abolitionists of that period. Yeah. Elizabeth Kane was clearly a racist, though she was probably opposed to slavery. You could be both. You could be a racist and still think slavery is wrong. That's, it's possible. But I began to see Brigham Young as a very different character than I'd thought. Yes, he had the limitations of his era with regard to race. But did he treat individual black people poorly? No. Apparently not. And I mean, there's a quote, and again, I can't come up with it off the top of my head exactly where it was, where there is a black man who's probably wandered across the LDS radar in a way, and I think from descriptions of him, he was probably unbalanced mentally in some way, and he's really treated badly, and Brigham gets upset by this, that he is a descendant of Adam, like everybody else, and he should be treated as such. Now that may not seem radical, but compared to the view that people have cultivated of Brigham, it's interesting.
It is interesting. What is the line? I think that it's so interesting because it's like, I've heard of all these different quotes, and I'm just thinking, well, somebody said, well, what about that? Well, he said that then. Well, he also said that there.
Yeah.
What is there, where is the line that's drawn, or is there even a line that's drawn when it comes to, having this empathy looking back towards the past?
Yeah.
Or some people might consider making excuses, right? Yeah. To like see somebody as they are in their time. We've heard the term presentism, right? We look at today, we know from today, and we look at the past through the lens of today. Is there any, and I don't know if I'm just thinking of this out loud as you're talking, is there any danger, or what is that line?
Well, there are obviously things like mass murder that are wrong in any era,
of course.
But there are other things where I think, no, the cultural fashions have changed so much that it's really wrong to look at a person from that previous generation and judge them as if they've had my advantages growing up with what I have grown up with. I grew up, when the civil rights movement was, I'm really old, but I mean, the civil rights movement was going on. And so I just, we never would broach certain issues or use certain terms because you just knew it was wrong. My mother grew up in St. George, and I remember her talking about, I think about 3 or 4 times in my life, she would use a term that I just think, oh, Mom, please don't say that in front of my friends. Well, she never used it in a harmful way. It was just a word she used. She grew up in St. George. She said, I never saw black people. She says, I remember when some came through, and a lot of us were looking at them and thinking, whoa, we've never seen anybody who looked like that, because their little homogenous white community didn't have anyone like that. And I hear the same things, frankly, about some of my people have gone over to film in Africa. These little kids gather around them and think, whoa, look at that. They're so weird looking because they've never seen a white person before. I mean, it's human nature.
Well, I just think that, again, I think, and maybe I'm asking the question more, I don't want to say devil's advocate. I'm just trying to say that, like, and I think it goes back to this theme that I think is emerging through this conversation, that that humans are human.
Yeah.
And we can put it in a box.
Yeah.
And if we put it in a box, there's danger there, but there's also danger with acting like stuff doesn't exist.
Right.
So
we have to face that.
We have to see the truth as the truth.
Yeah.
And at the same time, what is the truth? Can God work with people like this? Is it true that what's God going to do? Just all of a sudden all of the people of that era are just going to change in an instant?
If he could do that, then why doesn't he do it right now?
But isn't that what we would hope for us? But does it happen for us?
It does not happen for us.
Yeah.
He doesn't come in and do that. I wish the Lord.
But why doesn't he? I think that's an interesting
because we have freedom
question.
of the will, and he could come in and take away all my bad instincts and desires to sleep in on Sunday or whatever it is. He could do that, but it would be a violation of my agency to do that. I need to learn, and part of my growth is learning to overcome those things and to realize I was doing things that were wrong. Or I said something that was inappropriate, or I treated somebody unkindly. Or, I mentioned my mother with a specific reason in mind. I was involved in the discussion about race and so on. And I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have done it. But I raised the issue of my mother, and I said my mother would say things, very rarely, but occasionally, where I'd think, oh, man, that's embarrassing. We don't think that way anymore. But she was born decades before me, obviously, in a very different place. But I said in her defense, whenever I saw her interact with a black person, it was always respectful, always kind. We had a construction company when I was growing up, and most of our employees were Hispanic. We had only one black guy who was ever there on a regular basis. He was never treated any differently than anybody else. Always very kind. We liked him. He was a good guy. I grew up calling all these Hispanic guys and him my uncles, because when I was really young, I didn't know who my uncle really were. I didn't know what it meant, So he was Uncle Wilson, and they never corrected me. Don't say that, No, he was Uncle Wilson. He was nice to me. I was a little kid. I was the boss's son, so I was sort of the mascot for the company, and they treated me really kindly. So I had Uncle Tino and Uncle Hank and Uncle, all these guys, and Uncle Wilson, the black guy. No difference at all. So there's a difference between the culture that you grow up with and the ways you use language and the way you actually treat people. And I never saw her unkind to anyone, ever, over any racial issue or anything else. But then this is why I regret doing it. Then people said, no, she was a racist. You should have condemned her. I said, I'll not condemn my mother. She was a really good woman. If Wilson was sick, she would have brought food to him.
So what is it that we believe that causes us to have such a hard line there?
Makes us feel better sometimes to look down at other people. Sometimes I think it's as nasty as that. That's one of the reasons for racism. I may be low and unsuccessful, but I'm better than that guy.
My kids do this. I mean, with other topics. I mean, if I didn't do it, they did it. It's like, I'm not in trouble.
Right, exactly.
But is it human nature?
I think it is to look down on people who are different. I mean, in Egypt, the Egyptians had the notion that, in medieval Egypt, you read writing about Christians like the Byzantines. They have blue eyes. Blue eyes are demonic. They're satanic.
They're different.
White people are evil. They're different. And people who didn't look like the Egyptians were either too light or too dark or inferior. We are the right color. Everybody else is weird. And, until people started intermingling a little bit, basically they're the people over there. And they're funny. I mean, the Greeks divided the world into the Greeks and what they called the barbaroi, the barbarians. And that was everybody who wasn't Greek. It didn't matter how civilized they were or powerful they were. And the word barbaroi is really funny. It just comes from Greeks imitating their language. Bar, 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 bar. It's gibberish. It's nonsense. It's not Greek.
But isn't this interesting though? Because I've just been studying Genesis, Genesis in the early, because Come Follow Me.
Yeah.
And just the idea of identity being a source of division.
Yeah.
And even when he names all the different things, it's a way to divide. He divided.
Yeah.
He named the light.
Yeah.
From the name he gave it is what made the division.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then the question though is this, looking back on Brigham, looking back on all of these different people, whatever the circumstances are, a lot of that friction comes from these boxes.
Yes. And humans can't function without them.
Well, that are short term. You know what I'm saying? I think to President Nelson's point of why it's so important to focus on the eternal identities, because of that. There's all the friction is in the short term identities.
Yeah. We can't function without definitions. I mean, definition by definition is defining, setting up the finite limits of something. So if I say you're tall, that means you're not short. or, you're male, you're not female. I mean, we're always saying what you're not and what you are, and that's how we define words. In dictionaries, they're explaining, well, this is what it is. It's not that, implicitly or explicitly, it's not that. And we can't function without that. I remember a colleague, I just thought, we were going the rounds, and he said, well, I think it would be nice if we lived in a world without definitions. I said, well, we can't. When I say I'm going on a trip, that's a specific thing.
Yeah.
I'm not cooking.
Yeah.
I'm going on a trip.
You're making that.
Yeah. And he says, well, like Mormon and non-Mormon. I said, what would you have us do? Just to use language is to define. Shut the door. It's a specific thing to do.
Well, do you see, but doors, well, what does he say in the scripture? Like, all these things shall waste away. A door will waste away.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
But there are core identities that we need to remember, and they're more important. It doesn't matter that, it matters a little bit, obviously. If someone's Chinese, well, maybe I should learn Chinese to speak to him, or he's living over there or something like that. But the more fundamental core is he's a child of God.
And I know that almost sounds cliche.
Yeah.
But I'm asking this question because I'm trying to think. I'm just thinking as you're talking, what box have we put Brigham Young in? Or the people, what is that box?
Yeah.
And is that where the friction's coming from?
I think to a certain extent it is. He was an autocrat. He was authoritarian. He was a racist. He was a sexist. He was mean. He was verbally abusive sometimes. Many of these things are not even factually true, or they've been overdone. But I even say, let me tell you another story that takes him out of the box on race. We've been talking about race. This is a story. I hope to get this on tape. I believe it was recorded on film, and then the film was lost, alas. But you may know the name of Billy Johnson, who was a really important guy in Ghana.
Oh, yeah.
And, a pillar of the church. He's passed away now, but he was, I think he ended up being the patriarch of the stake in Accra or someplace. Anyway, there's a woman by the name of Marcy Brown who went over to do interviews there in the early 2000s. Pioneers of the church in Africa and so on. She interviewed Billy Johnson. And Billy told her a story, which to me is just remarkable, if it's true, and I have no reason to doubt it. He took her to a place I get the impression it was a warehouse. When I interview her, I'll have the details down better. But he said, there was a time in Ghana when the government threw out all the foreign missionaries. And this was not long after the church had arrived there. And so the people who were left there are thinking, how do we run this? I mean, we've only been in the church a little while. All the white missionaries from Salt Lake have been tossed. And so Billy Johnson's really worried because he's kind of the leading Latter-day Saint in Ghana at the time. And what do I do? What do I do? And he's praying for guidance. And so he showed her a place in this building. And he said, this is where Brigham Young appeared to me. And gave him instructions on what he should do. But his first words are to me.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
You just throwing out the story. Who had the dream?
This is Billy Johnson.
Billy Johnson had a dream.
Even a vision. It may not have been a dream.
And Brigham Young appeared
to him when he's praying to know how should he handle this, because they don't know when the missionaries are coming back. I think it's in the early 80s where Ghana shuts the church down, basically, hoping it'll go away.
I saw this video.
Yeah. Well, and so Brigham's opening words to him, to me, are really Brigham-esque. His opening words are something like, "Buck up, Johnson. Help is on its way." And then apparently gives him some guidance.
Yeah.
And I love the story because I'm thinking, don't put Brigham in a box, because even if Brigham had racist ideas, he's beyond that. So of all the people that could have been chosen, if this story is true, of all the people who could have been chosen by the Lord to send to Billy Johnson in Ghana, Brigham Young. So can you grow beyond your earthly box?
We're supposed to.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yeah. And so I just love that story.
So Brigham has some, and to many people say many. And what's interesting though is that it has been over the last 10 years, and maybe before that, I don't know. And with that, he does. It's almost like I said before, you pick up one end of the stick, you get the other end of the stick.
Yeah, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
What happens if you don't? What happens if you don't pick up Brigham? What happens if you don't pick up Brigham at all? You kind of mentioned this before.
Yeah.
What if we don't get Brigham?
Then maybe the church fails. I don't know. Was there a backup? I don't know. I have a theory this has nothing to do with Brigham. It's my speculative theory about Joseph. I've thought to myself sometimes, does the Lord have a backup? Now, if he doesn't need them, we never hear about them.
Yeah.
And if he does need them, we never hear about the guy who failed, you know?
Yeah.
But I've thought about a weird coincidence. In the Book of Mormon, you have the prophecy that in the latter days there will be a prophet named Joseph, son of a man named Joseph, and he'll do X, Y, and Z. Well, I come from a really bad line of the family. My family were, my mother's semi-active, most of my extended family, many of them not really diligent in the church. But I come through the line of Joseph Knight, who was a very early convert to the church. Joseph Knight Sr. and Joseph Knight Jr. Now, one day, as I was reading about their history, and I thought, okay, they were one of the first families, maybe the first family to join the church after the Restoration. They heard the story before there was a church. And then I thought, how weird that you have Joseph Knight Sr. and Joseph Knight Jr., and they're both a little bit younger than, respectively, Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. I thought, could they have been the backup plan? They lived in roughly the right area. They could have gone to Gomorrah if Joseph had failed. And I thought, well, I don't know, but what if the Lord has backup plans? Who would fulfill the prophecy? And we just wouldn't hear about the guy who messed it up, and we hear about the Knights instead of the Smiths. I don't know. Now, it's flattering to my family, but I've thought, could that have happened in other cases? Was there someone else out there who could have done what Brigham did? I'm not aware of anybody, but maybe Heber could have done it, because Heber is Brigham's right-hand man, and Heber Kimball, and
I mean,
God
could do it.
Yeah.
God could do it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He sent his own son.
Right. That's the one case
know
where
what I
I
mean?
know there wasn't a backup plan.
Yeah.
Everything hinged on Jesus being willing to do the atonement. There's no other son of God,
But
blameless.
he lets humans do it.
Yes, he does. And,
Why?
He wants us to learn. He wants us to grow. Even the prophets grow and learn. And could he do it infallibly and flawlessly? Yes, he could. But he doesn't do it. I mean, Moses has all sorts of issues and is rebuked on occasion and so on. He works through human beings. He always does.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. But he doesn't work through robots. He doesn't work through automatons, He works through people who sometimes are kind of dense and don't get it. And, I look at Joseph, and I think Joseph is given this is one thing that strikes me about Joseph. I'm going pretty far afield, but Joseph receives the revelation on the 3 degrees of glory early on, February of 1832. There is no evidence that really impacts him for several years thereafter. He still goes on talking about heaven and hell. And then he goes back late in the 1830s and he rewrites that vision in sort of doggerel verse. And I don't know what came first, the versification, and that got him to thinking about it, or thinking about him got him to
Doggerel
the verse.
verse? What's that?
Kind of bad poetry.
Okay.
It's not very good, but it summarizes section 76. But then all of a sudden he begins to talk about 3 degrees of glory. It really has an impact on his thinking. To me, that's an argument that it didn't come from his mind, because it takes him about 7 or 8 years to get it. I mean, he's had this spectacular vision, but it doesn't sink in. So even with Joseph, he didn't always get it. He's told to do things, and he delays, and the Lord has to rebuke him. And,
I mean, he lost the 116
Yes.
I mean, he lost them.
and the Lord had told him multiple times, no. He keeps coming back, please, please, until the Lord says, all right, you're going to learn something from this. And he allows him to do it and flub up and mess up big time. I imagine that was a step forward for Joseph, in a way. I will learn next time not to dispute with the Lord. If he tells me to do it, I'm going to do it.
Well, but this topic I think is interesting, because I think, and I've heard this, it's like, well, if prophets made mistakes back then, what mistakes are they making now? Just the same way we say, say, and I don't know how we jump there so quickly, right?
Right.
And I think, but I do know that is an assumption that people make.
Yeah, so our prophets fallible today? Yes, they are. Now, I don't think they're fallible in any gross way. They're not leading us astray. Wilford Woodruff said the Lord won't allow that. He'll remove the president of the church rather than allow that. But can there be mistakes? Can there be false steps? Can there be church programs that we try out and then say, nah, It didn't work. I'm sure that happens all the time. The Lord will basically say, do X, but he won't always tell you exactly how you're supposed to do X.
The plates getting the plates.
Yeah.
Getting it in both ways with Joseph and with Nephi.
Yeah, exactly. So he gives us a lot of freedom and a lot of latitude, and it makes things messier than they could have been if the Lord just came in and dictated, okay, this is exactly how you do it, and don't deviate from this. In fact, maybe I'll take away your freedom and I won't allow you to deviate from what I want. No, he doesn't do that. He never has done that.
You believe that?
I believe that. I believe that, when you're dealing with prophets and apostles, even today, and I'm not trying to undercut their authority. I have boundless respect.
And so you see
for
why
leaders.
this is such a sensitive end.
Yeah, but I see them and I think they are humans.
But why do we? I just think that what are we assuming that we would even have that mindset of what are they getting wrong now? You know what I mean? Like, why would that be the first?
Because are we looking for an out? Like, I don't have to do that because it's probably just his opinion.
Yeah.
And I think that's dangerous to do. I think the safest thing is to say, no, I'm going to take very seriously what he says and try to do it. Is he wrong in some detail or other? Maybe, but I won't go too far wrong if I try to just follow what he's teaching.
But the doctrine of Christ.
That's fundamental.
But that's what I think is the astray.
Yeah.
The path that leads to Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah.
That leads back to the presence of God. That is what I think is the essence of what the gospel is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And is it this or that program? No, those things can come and go, and they can be adjusted and improved, and sometimes they're wrong. But you won't go too far astray if you follow them. But the basic thing is follow the doctrine of Christ. I mean, faithful discipleship, trying to be kind, trying to serve. You're never going to be wrong on that kind of thing. You can't go very far wrong by trying to serve people. Yeah. Or by praying. How wrong can you be?
We have a lot of information today, I think is what it is, about every topic, about everything. And there's so many opinions. And again, back to the boxes, right? The more we put ourselves in boxes, the more we have this friction of, well, he said this about this policy, he said this about that thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then back in the history, right? With Brigham. If we put him in a box, it's like it's easy for there to be the most friction. And you see this vision that he has when Brigham's out of the box. Yeah. And it's the bigger picture. It's the eternal perspective. Right. It's the things that really matter. And he says, buck up. Yeah. Help is coming. Yeah. To get the real job done, Yeah.
Yeah. I can imagine that if when you arrive in the next life, you think, oh, man, okay, I had this little limited view, but now I see it. I see the bigger picture. Yeah. And I was sort of right, but wrong on some things. If we're not surprised when we arrive in the next life, I will be surprised. Because I'm thinking,
surprised.
Yeah, I'll be surprised I'd be surprised if I didn't get some things wrong here, that I imagined things. And
man, I've got a lot of things wrong.
I'll tell you an experience I had with one of my children. When he was really young, I was driving him to a preschool class, and he was in the back seat with one of his little friends, and they were jabbering away, and I wasn't paying much attention. And all of a sudden, I heard one of them say, I began to listen, we're going to kindergarten next year. And I've heard about that teacher, that she's really tough, and I'm thinking to myself, you guys have no idea what's coming. Kindergarten's tough. Man, you've got algebra and trigonometry and history and everything ahead of you. You guys, but you're so serious about it. You think you know what you're talking about. And so it was cute, to hear them speculating about what kindergarten was going to be like, man, school. And then all of a sudden, I was not thinking theologically, but all of a sudden I thought, that must be how the Lord looks at us doing theology. He calls his angels over to his side, and here he says, look, the high priests, they're doing doctrine. Aren't they cute? They don't really know what they're talking about. They're speculating, does God know all things, or does he not? Or does God progress, or does he not? They couldn't even comprehend the answer if it were given to them. He's come over, listen to them. Oh, they're so cute. They're so cute. Because we're like little children. And, a little child who begins to toddle, staggering from mom to dad across 2 feet in the living room. It's actually not very well done, but it's cute. And that's us speculating about eternal matters that go beyond the basics, I think. Cute, but don't get too wedded to it, because we just don't know a lot of these things. But we do know some basics. Salvation is in Christ. Faith and service and hope are good. Charity is good. Those things are all good. And temple ordinances are important. Do we understand exactly how and why? No. Does that matter? No.
Yeah.
You do it because your parent, who is far wiser than you are. The gap between us is far greater than between a couple of preschoolers and their dad.
Of course.
God is so much wiser than we are and more knowing. Just when he says to do something, it's best to just do it.
You've done a lot of research. You've done a lot on a number of different topics. Has there ever been a time where you figured that, oh, you know what? I was wrong about that.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, there have been cases where historical understanding that I thought I had, or there are things that I thought mattered a great deal. One area in which I can say I've changed. I was maybe all teenagers are like this. When I grew up in an apartment member family, I kind of came to the church on my own. My mother wasn't really active. My father was a non-member until the night I was set apart as a missionary. I baptized him, which was, a good start to a mission.
You baptized?
I baptized my father. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You baptized your father.
My brother set him apart, confirmed him.
You can't just stop it there. Tell me about that.
Well, growing up, I would have arguments with my dad. He was sympathetic to the church. These weren't arguments in the sense of angry, but just defend the church's position on this. He was friendly to the church. His nickname was Bishop. He was a really good guy, but he didn't attend almost never. And but when we were building our chapel in the days when saints built their own chapels, he ran a construction business. He donated equipment and labor and things like that to help build it. And so people kept wondering, well, why hasn't he joined? Well, he just didn't think it was true. It was nice. Members are good people, but it's not true. So we'd have discussions where we'd argue about doctrine and so on. And I remember I finally just thought, I'm just making no progress with him. And so I just thought, it's not worth it. I'm going to go on a mission shortly. He's supportive. He'll support me on my mission and so on. And I remember he asked my brother, who had also become active in the church, and he asked my brother, why doesn't Dan argue with me anymore? And he says, well, I think he's lost hope. He doesn't see any point. You're not moving any closer to joining, so why argue about things? I think that got him to thinking. And so he told me later, I asked him, so what was it that got you going? He said, well, I'd always been friendly to the church. I didn't think it was a bad thing. But he said, I began looking at some of your books. I had books by Hugh Nibley, for example, and he began reading those, and he said, it occurred to me, could this possibly be true? Could this actually be true? And finally, the night that I gave my farewell, I spoke in sacrament meeting. Then we had a little thing at my parents' house. It's not always looked kindly upon, but we had a little farewell thing, and people came, and the bishop came. And my dad took him aside, and he said, is there any chance that I could be baptized before my son leaves for Salt Lake on Wednesday or whatever it was? And I think the bishop probably almost fainted because nobody expected this. And so I think it was Tuesday night that I baptized him. My brother confirmed him, and I was set apart as a missionary after that.
So your dad's in the water. He comes out of the water.
Yeah.
And what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, wow, I never thought that would happen. And he was in a bishopric within a year.
Did.
Yeah, it did. So
you never thought your dad...
I really didn't see it happening. I mean, I'd thought for a while maybe, but there was no progress. He was making no progress. But inwardly, he was thinking about these things.
What did it mean to you?
Oh, it meant a huge amount. And then when I came back, we were sealed in the temple. And in the meanwhile, he'd been serving a bishopric. Almost the first day he was eligible, he was called into a bishopric because he was that kind of a guy. And
your dad's perfect?
No.
Never makes mistakes?
No. He was a really good man and a gentle man.
You saw him change.
Yeah, I did see him change. And he took it seriously. So that was impressive to me. And he was absolutely supportive of my mission. I have to say, when they took me up to Salt Lake, dropped me off at the old mission home, we had a prayer. They came up in a camper. They had a camper, and so we had a prayer in the camper before I walked in, and he began to sob. I had never seen my father cry. He's a Scandinavian, they just don't do that. He always laughed that when he went off to World War II, where he might be killed, his father shook his hand. This is just, we don't show a lot of emotion. But he began to sob and cry. And I remember having a crisis of faith right then. I thought, what am I doing? Yeah, I've never seen my father cry. And he's crying right now as I'm about to walk into the mission home in Salt Lake. Is this the right thing to do? Well, I did. And you know, he was supportive, and it made a great difference in our family, I think, to have me sending letters home every week and that kind of thing. So it was a great experience
It was
for
a
me.
big, I can just tell when you're telling me that it means a lot to you.
Yeah, it did. And so to be able to go to the temple and be sealed together as a family and so on. My brother was actually, he was not my father's son. My mother had been married before, and that man had died fairly young. And then she'd married my father. And so when the time came to seal the family together, my mother wanted to know with my brother, my half-brother, is this all right with you? I mean, do you want to be sealed? And he said, look, my dad, my dad is the only father I've ever known. He's, Evan, the previous husband, had died when he was a few months old. He said, he's my father. And yes, I want to be sealed to him. And so that was a great day too. I just going into the temple sealing room and thinking, wow, we've done it. We've been sealed together, and we're now together as a family. It was a marvelous thing, marvelous experience. So I always tell people, when you're thinking, oh, my dad, my father, my mother will never join the church, or I'm working on this person, don't give it up. You never know.
People can change.
Yeah, they can, and they can change. They may be changing in ways you can't even see.
They'll surprise you, huh?
Yeah, and so you don't judge according to the outward appearance. Another story, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm full of stories, but there was a fellow, I won't use his name, who was at my high school and I grew up in California in the 60s with all that entails. A lot of psychedelic stuff, and it was pretty wild. And this fellow was in the class ahead of mine, but somehow I got to know him a little bit, and I liked him, but he was wild as could be, and he went off to, hope I'm not giving away too much information, he went off to UC Santa Cruz, which made Berkeley look like BYU in those days. And so he was not a member of the church, and he was as wild as anybody could. He was a bright guy, but if you'd given me a list of people who would never join the church, I probably would have put him on the list. Just he didn't seem the type, and so on. Then I ran into him after my mission, walking along north of the Harold B. Lee Library, and there he is sitting on the lawn. I hadn't seen him in years, and I'd never seen him in this context. I'd seen him in California in high school in the 60s. And so I called out his name, and he turned around and he says, "Oh, Dan." And I said, "What are you doing here? Well, you're sitting on the lawn at BYU?" He said, "Oh, you probably haven't heard." And I said, "Haven't heard what?" He says, "I just got back from my mission." And I said, "From your what?" I said, "Oh," he told me the story. Joined the church at UC Santa Cruz. Least likely guy, if you'd asked me, will he ever join the church? No, not a chance. So I just always say, never assume. You can't know. And I think I heard, last thing I heard was he was a bishop in Chicago or something like that. But
this guy,
yeah,
that did all this,
but I would not have predicted it. And so,
what does that mean?
What that means is it's not for us to judge. You just keep spreading the gospel, spreading the word, setting an example if you can, doing the right things, and you never know what impact that will have. You can't predict. I could tell you story after story of that. You can cut them all out. But
well, I'm just saying. I mean, and I just wanted to get that detail of your dad. I think that was important.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, you started to tell me about even you, right? Yeah. You've done research on topics that matter.
Yeah.
Right? That you've spent a lifetime of just researching. Was there anything that you were like certain was a certain way, and then you discovered later that it wasn't the case? Yeah.
Well, I started to say that I was very judgmental. That's one thing where I've changed. I was pretty rigid when I became active in the church, and if you violated the rules, man, you're out. It's a serious violation. Then I began to encounter cases where I thought, I just can't. I can't be that harsh because I know the circumstances that went into this, and I can't blame this person.
What changed?
Well, I can think of one specific story. There was, how much can I tell without? I don't want to embarrass anyone.
Of course.
But I was called to be a family father at BYU. I don't know if they even still do that. I don't know if they do. But they used to organize sort of family groups where we'd get together on Monday night. It was before my mission, and I was in charge of a family group that had a few guys and several girls. There was a new girl who moved in. She had not been LDS until recently, and she began asking me questions like, well, if you commit sins, why should you confess to a bishop? It'd come up again and again, 2 or 3, 4 times. I thought, okay, there's something going on here. There's something troubling her. So I took her aside one night, and I said, look, if you have something you need to talk with the bishop about, I can help arrange that. I'll make a contact with the bishop. Oh, no, there's nothing. And then the next day I got a note saying, I need to talk to the bishop. I've got something terrible I need to talk with him about. Well, I went with her. She said, can you drive me? I don't think I can drive. I'm too emotional. So I drove her. I think the bishop thought that it involved me because I got ushered right in. What am I doing here? I don't even know exactly what it is. But he had me there, and she tried to confess. At one point, she did confess something terrible, a sexual transgression. Only he didn't hear, I think. He missed it. I did, but she didn't. Then she began to sob again. He said, well, what is it you've done? And I thought, oh, no, she has to repeat this? And, well, maybe Dan can help. And no, I can't. I don't have anything to do with this. But the more I learned about her, the more I thought, in my incarnation a few weeks ago, I would have said, wow, she's committed the sin, church discipline, et cetera, et cetera. I'd gotten to know her, and I thought she was a sad, sad person, grown up in an abusive family that didn't treat her well at all. So she was prey for any guy who showed her any attention. If they were kind to her at all, she'd collapse. And so there were people who abused that, men who exploited her. And I thought, I would have condemned her even a few weeks ago because I was this young, righteous, future missionary. And now that I know her, it's not that easy. I can't.
That's always the case, huh?
Yeah, this is a harder case. It's again, you start seeing ambiguities and you start feeling the humanness of it. And did something need to be done? Yes, and I'm sure the bishop did it. But could I just condemn her? No, I couldn't. And I began to see that part of the New Testament. The Savior, I don't condemn this woman, It's not to say that he's indifferent to sin, but I think my rough edges began to come off a little bit then. So I like to think when I was serving as a bishop, I like to think if one thing people could pick up was I genuinely cared about them. Even when they came in and told me sometimes things that made my jaw drop about things they'd done where I'd think, man, I didn't even know you could do that. Yeah. But I try not to show too much emotion and try to do something to help them. That was one way that I've grown. Now, in terms of history and doctrine, I'm less certain about certain things than I was, more certain about others. I'd say the fundamental things, but on some doctrinal issues, I think I don't really know, and I won't say I don't care, but I don't need to know now because someday I will. Yeah. And where once I would have argued, this is the way it is because this scripture says this and this scripture says, now I'll say, well, it's one way you can read it. But I can see other ways of reading it, and I just don't know. I heard a story that I love. I travel a lot, and once I was out of the country when a group of friends of mine decided to get together and have a little gathering on what it meant to be a Latter-day Saint scholar. And so they just got a room in the Kimball Tower, I think on a Saturday, and they gathered around a seminar table and said, let's talk about it. Do Latter-day Saint scholars have a little different approach, or should they take a little different approach than if they weren't Latter-day Saints? And they were just about to get started when there was a knock at the door. One of them told me later because I wasn't there. And they said, come in, and Henry Eyring came in, who was at that time a member of the First Presidency, I think. And he said, I heard that you were doing this little seminar. And he said, I don't have an assignment this weekend. And I heard about it, and I thought, well, I used to be a Latter-day Saint scholar, so maybe this would be fun. Would you mind if I join? Well, nobody's going to say, no, you may not come in. So, but he did say a few funny things. He said, and the relevant one is, he said, there are a lot of issues where the average high priest group, back when we had those, he said the average high priest group is a lot more certain about particular doctrinal issues than the first presidency are. And I thought, I'll bet that's true. There are people out there who think they've got it nailed down, where actually the doctrine hasn't been revealed. The Lord doesn't have to tell us every single little detail. We probably wouldn't understand it anyhow if he told us the full thing. So relax,
More information changes the perspective.
Yeah, and sometimes it makes you less certain. Now, I won't say it makes me less certain about the fundamentals, but it makes me less certain about certain doctrinal issues where I once could have laid down, this is the way it is in eternity, and so on. Now I don't know, and I figure I'll learn, and I'll be blown away by it. It'll be sort of what I thought, but not exactly what I thought.
So things have changed.
Yeah.
Your perspective has changed. You feel less judgmental.
Yeah.
Where before it was more, this is the only way.
Really cut and dried, black and white. Now it isn't so much.
Well, let's go back to Brigham. I think that that's important, even in that same context, right? I mean, when it comes to him, and even in this new series that you're doing, right?
Yeah.
We obviously know that he wasn't perfect.
Right.
We know that there have been we only went through the race side, right? There's all these others. What have you found out? What kind of leader was he? What were some of the things that you found that when he was under pressure that he faced? What did you see?
Yeah, he was absolutely devoted to the cause of building up Zion. He really believed in it, and everything he did was an attempt to do that. People say, well, he was a great colonizer. He was a great organizer. Yeah, but he was only doing that for the cause of Zion, not because he wanted to plant poplar trees or dig irrigation canals for their own sake. That was a means to an end, and the end was the gathering of Israel, the establishment of Zion, the construction of temples, and building the kingdom. But I remember years ago I was on the Gospel Doctrine Writing Committee, and it fell to me to write the lesson on Brigham Young. And I thought then, I was already thinking about these things long before I got involved with this Becoming Brigham series. I said, I'm tired of Brigham Young, the organizer, the colonizer, the pioneer. That's all true, and he's great. But I want to emphasize a different side for this gospel doctrine lesson that I'm now called upon to write. So I emphasized Brigham Young, the temple builder, and I concentrated on the dedication of the St. George Temple and how he wanted that temple built. The Salt Lake Temple was taking forever. He wanted a temple built where ordinances could be done for the living and the dead. And so I quoted speeches from him there at the dedication. He said, sometimes I want the tongues of 7 thunders to wake this people up. If they knew how important this work is, this house would be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, I'm thinking that is not, from a worldly perspective, the practical man of action, the organizer. Because from a worldly point of view, temples are pointless. I mean, it's meaningless stuff. Rituals for the dead. I mean, what's that? You should be out building communities, digging canals, planting trees, sowing crops. But for Brigham Young, the really important thing was not that. It was the temple and the ordinances for the living and the dead. He really wanted that built. Now, by the way, when that lesson came out, it had gone through correlation, and it was back to Brigham Young, the colonizer, and Brigham Young, the organizer. But even then, that was important to me. So it's important in our movie, 6 Days in August. One of the last scenes is Brigham Young performing ordinances in the temple for the people who've lined up desperately wanting the ordinances.
Before they...
Yeah. Here he is. He should be out outfitting wagons, shouldn't he? Building wagons, organizing the food for the trek westward. Yeah, he needs to do that. But he spent day and night in the temple doing the ordinances. And then we close with this note that when we get to Utah, we'll build other temples. Temples were important to him. And so one of the first things he does to go out and mark out that spot on the floor of the Salt Lake Valley, here we will build the temple of our God. Because it wasn't just about getting people out west so they could have farms and make money and, pioneer. It was to build the kingdom, and the kingdom was about temples. That is a leitmotif through his life. I mean, you see it at the end of Nauvoo, the beginning of Salt Lake. He never falters on that.
Over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So the temple itself, and that research, anything else, what would you say something that you've learned about him as a leader that surprised you?
I think I've mentioned his dedication to Joseph. I think I've seen his sense of humor in many cases, where I think I can see the twinkle in the eye, where you read it at first and think, oh, yeah, that's pretty brusque, and then you think, no, I've gotten to know him a little bit better, and I think he was being humorous. He was he always had a wink. He was serious, but not about himself, and that's been important. Yeah, I think those are some of the things that I've learned. I've learned that that some of the decisions he made, they're either sheer dumb luck or they're inspired. I just don't know. Reading about the American Indian situation and interviewing people. The Saints came into the Great Salt Lake Valley. It turns out, apparently, and I didn't know this, it's one of the things I learned from the interviews, Salt Lake Valley was a kind of no man's land between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. It was kind of a buffer zone.
Yeah.
They didn't go into it. So when the Saints arrived, they didn't really care. It wasn't their territory. Go ahead, do what you want. It's when the Saints began moving out of that valley to the north, they encountered the northern tribes. To the south, the southern tribes. Then there were clashes. And I don't know, did we know that when we went into the valley, or was that the Lord guiding us, or what? I don't know. And then I learned something about, and this is kind of negative, why were there such clashes between the Saints and the Native Americans? I had thought, well, Utah's a big place. Why couldn't we all live together? I mean, not that many Latter-day Saints in those days, and not that many Native Americans. Just stay out of each other's way. Well, there's a reason why we didn't, and it says we didn't communicate well at all. When the Saints came in, they would build their settlements logically by the mouths of canyons where water was coming down out of the mountains, because that gave them good pasturage for their animals, good water if they're irrigating their crops. And so they would tend to build American Fork, Provo, where there were mountain streams coming down. But those were exactly the places where the Native Americans would come for hunting, because that's where their prey gathered, the animals they were hunting. They would come to the mountain streams where the water came down, where there was good forage for them to eat. And so we weren't clashing over all of Utah. We were clashing over specific good locations along the mountains, the bases of the mountains. There must have been ways, should have been ways, we could have worked that out. There's plenty of water, for all of us, but we didn't. And so ignorantly, we clashed many times. And the Native Americans did horrible, atrocious things, but so frankly did some of the Latter-day Saints. And that was important to learn. And we're not going to whitewash that in this Becoming Brigham series. We did some things, we speaking collectively, that, oh man, I wish we hadn't done that. But it was ignorance, anger sometimes. But I learned that, the Saints needed to repent too. There are things we did that were wrong. And
of course, everybody.
Yeah.
Why do we think that? Why do we think that there?
Yeah.
Is that the assumption? Maybe is it because the distinction of this is the true and living church?
Yeah. So we can't do anything wrong.
And so we can't. Maybe
the Saints always wear the white hats. No,
but see that focus is on us.
Yeah.
Not on the actual Redeemer. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and telling the story of the Saints in Missouri, for example, for this Becoming Brigham thing, I'm learning, okay, sometimes the Missourians had some legitimate grievances, and we didn't always behave the way we should have, and we could have done better than we did. Now, I'm still not sure the Missourians would have welcomed us. We were, for example, coming back to the race issue, they saw us as abolitionists, and that was going to tip the balance in Missouri, which was, was it going to be a slave state or a free state? Well, the Saints start coming in, and that could upset everything. So I'm not sure we would have ever done really well in Missouri at that time, before the Compromise of 1850 and some of these things that where they were trying to solve those issues. But we didn't always do well, and then we'd come out by saying things like, well, this land is ours because the Lord has given it to us. Well, yeah, but the Lord wants us to buy it, not take it. But we didn't make it clear that that's what we were going to do. We're going to acquire it legitimately. But they saw it as, you're coming in to occupy this territory and steal it from us. And we weren't clear enough about what we were intending to do. I mean, just at point after point, you can say, well, there are enough mistakes to go around. There's enough blame to go around that I don't want to say the saints were always wrong. And fundamentally, it was a religious issue. They hated us because modern prophets, led by a prophet,
They
this is horrible.
being
The Missourians,
Missourians in
the
that
mobs,
case.
and so on. But we could have made things better, and we didn't. And so I've come away, again, maybe a little more judgmental than I would have been growing up, reading the history where it was the Latter-day Saints with the white hats and the Missourians with the black hats. Well, it's still a little bit that way, but not entirely, not as clearly as you would want it. In fact, can I share an example or an illustration of this? Years ago, I heard a speech from Stanley Kimball, who was a great whatever, Heber C. Kimball, and a history professor back in Illinois. But he would write on European history, but also occasionally on Latter-day Saint history. He wrote the standard biography of his ancestor, Heber C. Kimball, for example. But he gave a talk once that has really struck me, and I've tried to find it. I can't find it anywhere in print or online. Maybe it's out there, and I just haven't looked widely enough. But he talked about what he called the 3 levels of the gospel. And he was an active Latter-day Saint. So, but he said, look, there's level A. That's kind of the junior Sunday school version that we teach in church. The saints are always right. We always did the right thing, and the bad guys are just bad. Just who knows why? They just are evil. And he said, and that's typically what we sort of teach in church. Now, maybe a little less so now, but then. And he said, as a historian, that bothers me because it's not quite accurate. But he said, then there's level B. And level B is the polar opposite. I mean, it's like the negative version of level A. It's the anti-Mormon version. Everybody you thought was good is bad. Everything that the saints did that you thought was good is evil. Everything we teach is wrong. And he said, yeah, that's the version you get from the anti-Mormons. And he said, now, once someone's been exposed to that, what he called level B, he says it's difficult sometimes to save them. I mean, if they start believing that, then they're going to be out of the church. He said, now, my ideal as a historian would be to get them to level C, which is where you take on some of that negative stuff and you realize, yeah, it's not entirely false, but level A is not fundamentally wrong. He says, I'm here to tell you that as a historian, I believe level A is fundamentally right. And if I were in charge of the church, I might not try to take them through level B to level C. I might leave them at level A because you lose people. If they start finding out, well, our leaders have been fallible, saints haven't always been perfect, we've made mistakes, there have been missteps. He said, well, some people are going to lose faith in the church there. And he said, I wouldn't want that on my conscience. So maybe level A is the best after all. But he said the ideal would be to get to level C, where you understand that, yeah, the claims of the church are true. Have the humans teaching that and practicing that always done it right? No, not always. The Lord is working through imperfect vessels.
1 Nephi chapter 8.
Yeah.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Lehi is not the focus of that.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the tree.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So if you want something perfect, you're not going to find it in the church. None of us are, which means that collectively the church doing things isn't going to be perfect. Will we make errors, say stupid things, teach incorrectly here and there? I know I've over the years done things, made moves as a bishop that I regretted or almost made them. Thank heaven for counselors, where occasionally.
But of course you did.
Yeah, yeah.
What if you didn't ever do it?
Right.
But isn't that important to consider? What if we never did it wrong?
Right.
What does that world look like?
No,
I don't want to derail what you're saying, but
no, it's inconceivable.
I'm just thinking about this over and over again. The more it's kind of hitting the same idea. Like, what is the benefit of God allowing this?
Yeah.
Is there a benefit?
No, because we have to live in a world that's imperfect.
Is there a benefit? Yeah.
We
understand.
Need to.
Yeah. Why does he need for us to figure it out?
Because that's how we will grow. If he just hands it all to us, we'll never be like him. If he lets us struggle and discover it on our own. I know often it's teaching small children or other people, it's more helpful to have them discover a principle on their own than to tell it to them. Once they see this is true, I understand this now. You can guide them, sort of nudge them and observe, as I think the scriptures do. Now, do you learn the lesson from this? We can point it out. But a lot of times humans have to learn it themselves. They have to scuff their knees and and do some dumb things on their own before they will really get it. And then they can teach with authority, not because they learned it by rote memory, but because I can speak to you because I've been there.
That's important. That is so important.
Yeah.
Brigham now can speak differently. He could at the end. Same
Yeah.
thing you could say for every prophet. Same thing you could say for every parent. Same thing for every person.
Even
There's-
the Savior. Even the Savior. He learned by his experience.
Yes.
And he had to learn how to succor people and to feel with them in their affliction. I don't know if even the Lord could have come here having read a book about the mortal experience. Okay, got it. Without having come and experienced hunger and pain and injustice and things like that. When you come out of that, then you know it in a way you didn't know it before. If you read all about France, but you then go to France, it's different than it was reading about it.
This is what faith is.
Yeah.
Well, we've been doing this project with Elder Corbridge, and yesterday we were filming this, and he was talking about faith, and it's just the simple doctrine of faith.
Yeah.
But Thomas, to know, blessed art thou, Thomas, for thou hast believed after you saw. Basically, I mean, I'm not saying the word for word, but to know to believe and to know without seeing.
Yeah.
That's where we grow.
Right.
When you move forward in maybe even not doing it perfectly.
Yeah.
But still going forward, still continuing to go back to God's presence or try to help others get to God's presence. But that endeavor, that intention.
Yes. I know when I've moved forward, sometimes not entirely sure of what I was doing, and then it's worked out. I think, okay, that's a principle learned, and the Lord wants us to exercise faith. And then our faith is strengthened because the results of faith are delivered to us.
The results of faith.
The results of faith, the fruits of faith come to you because you made an experiment upon the word, if you will, and it turned out right. And after a while, your faith becomes strengthened, your confidence becomes strong because you find, for example, just in general, living this lifestyle is a good thing. Living the commandments of the Lord has led me to happiness and good things that have come my way that wouldn't have come if I hadn't. And gradually begin to think, okay, I have enough experience under my belt, if you will, trying to live the gospel and doing things where I wasn't sure how it would turn out, but it turned out all right. This next step I can now take with a little more confidence because I've been here before, in a way, and I've stepped out into the darkness a little bit, and it was okay.
What does the church look like? Say you look back and Brigham made every perfect decision.
Yeah.
What is the church like without any fumble?
Yeah. No, I can't even imagine it for one thing. But I think we have learned experience. Even the Lord tells us to call upon it. We have learned by sad experience. That is the nature and disposition of almost all men. Now you learn by experience, and you learn by experimentation, and just trying to colonize Utah. They would plant a crop, and it turned out it didn't do very well in Utah. So forget that one. Let's try a different one. This does well. We can do this. We can't really do that. We can try this experiment with people, and it will work. This one won't. You find in leading people that some things are effective. The message is delivered very well that way, but not another way. And it'll change from group to group. You have to be sensitive. You can't go by a script. I've seen missionaries who try to teach from a script. And you look at the people they're trying to teach and think, this is not registering with them at all.
Yeah.
Why don't you look up, figuratively from your text and look at them and decide what the Spirit is telling you to tell them? I've seen cases where we don't want to deviate from the program and then it just doesn't work, where if you change things a little bit, it might have. I understand that Elder Perry, when he was stake president in Boston, made some of the early reforms or changes to the young adult programs in the church because he didn't feel they were working in his stake in Boston. And I'm told that somebody found out he was doing things differently and said, you should stop that or you'll be released, to which his response, I think, was, so release me. I mean, it's not like I need to be stake
You're
president.
just trying to.
and then the next reaction, though, wasn't to release him. It was to call him to be a general authority.
Really?
Because they like people who've tried things and seen them work. I mean, Harold B. Lee with the welfare program and other things like that, where, we're looking for ideas, not just from the Lord, but from our own experience. The Lord has never dictated every step to us, never. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want little robots. How could, I've looked at it this way. The Lord wants to give us everything he has, all his power and authority. How can he give that to somebody who's never exercised any independent judgment before? Now he says, okay, you've always followed dictation. You've done exactly what I told you to do, not freely, but because I kind of forced you to. Now I'm going to make you all-powerful and independent. It'd be a disaster. You don't say, okay, I refuse to ever train you to drive the car, or give you any experience driving the car. Now, here are the keys. A child would end up in a ditch.
Well, that was the temptation of Satan, right? He tempts Eve and Adam to partake of the fruit without sacrifice.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And that's what is the danger, to believe that you can have without sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Without experience.
Yeah, you can't.
It means nothing. It's meaningless.
Yeah. And so, my sense of knowing something is wrong is very different than it is after I've done it and discovered the consequences were really bad. Then, okay, I know it in a different way than I knew it before.
So it's power. It's a useful way to do it.
Yeah.
It actually has a better impact.
Yeah, it does. The Lord could have just given us all a manual about mortality. Said, let's just dispense with this business of going to earth. Can't work. We don't learn that way. And the learning from experience is a richer, deeper, more fundamental knowledge than book learning.
It just makes me think of that verse that whenever we were discussing before, 2 Nephi, right? And the verse that's after it, I think is actually, it goes along with this. Because he says, and I think it's the pattern that we don't understand. And he kind of juxtapose. He shows a comparison. For behold, thus saith the Lord, I will give it. Thus saith the Lord God, I will give unto the children of men line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little, and blessed are those who hearken unto my precepts and lend an ear unto my counsel.
Yeah.
For they shall learn wisdom. For unto him that receiveth I will give more, and from them that shall say, we have enough, from them shall be taken away, even that which they give. But then he says, cursed is he that putteth his trust in man, or putteth flesh, or maketh flesh his arm, and shall hearken unto the precepts of men, save their precepts shall be given by the power of the Holy Ghost. And here's the punchline. Woe unto the Gentiles, saith the Lord God of hosts, for notwithstanding I shall lengthen mine arm out unto them from day to day. They will deny me. They will get it wrong. They will deny me. Nevertheless, I will be merciful unto them, saith the Lord God, if they will repent and come unto me, for mine arm is lengthened out all the day long.
Yeah.
I just think that in the pursuit, in the desire to make it back to his presence, he's like, look, I know you're not going to get it perfect every time, but I'm still going to be there.
Yeah.
And if you choose to turn to me, I will be merciful unto you. I will. And I think that maybe we don't believe that. And that's why we project it onto other people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's instructive that in the temple, a provision is made for a savior before we've really done much. It's not like this a failure in the plan. It was the plan to let us come out and, stumble around, make mistakes, and save us nonetheless if we call upon the Savior. It was never like, oh, dang, I meant to have them go down and live perfect lives, and they were going to be saved, but now I've got to come up with some stopgap way of fixing this. No, the Lord always intended to do that. That is the plan.
Well, it makes me, in Moses chapter 5, right, when Adam and Eve, they're both saying, if we hadn't transgressed, we would have never had seed. We would have never known.
Right.
We would have never eaten, like Lehi, we would have never have really truly known.
Yeah.
know?
Now, I don't want people to misunderstand what I've said. I've said book
Yeah.
learning isn't enough,
Yeah.
So then you might say, well, why the scriptures? Why wouldn't experience be enough? Well, because we can be pretty dense and not learn from experience very quickly. So it's a combination of experience and book learning. In other words, if you read the scriptures, you go out, you try to implement them, you mess up, you come back, you read the scriptures, you'll see something else that you hadn't realized. You see it differently. That interplay between reading what the Lord has said and our own experience, I think, is a really productive way to learn. And our experiences will make us see the scriptures differently.
Yeah.
I remember being, I was in some sort of small gathering with Boyd K. Packer, and he was making a comment about some passage that he had just encountered in the Book of Mormon. And he said, I promise you, that verse was not in the Book of Mormon any previous time I'd read it. But he said there was an issue that we were dealing with at church headquarters. Oh, I just didn't know which way to go. And I'm reading along, and suddenly that verse was there.
What was it?
I don't remember what it was. I don't know if he even told us. But he said, suddenly I noticed it. It had been there all along, but I never needed it in the same way until then. And so it's that cross-pollination, if you will, between experience and scriptures, where you learn a lesson from experience, the scriptures make it clear to you. You go back into experience, you mess up, you come back to the scriptures, you read something else that you needed to read that maybe hadn't hit you before. I mean, I still have the set of scriptures I took to BYU when I went as an undergraduate, and I marked a lot of passages. They're falling apart now. I can't really use them, but I've kept them because it's interesting to me that I marked certain passages that I think are really important passages, but I didn't mark passages that now strike me as really important. I sailed right past them because in my 17, 18-year-old mind, those didn't speak to me. Well, now they do.
Can you give me one?
Oh, boy, I'm looking at a page, but I can't really come up with it off the top of my head. But there are passages about, well, even, I'll tell you one that matters to me now, where Jacob says, our life passed away with us as it were a dream. Being lonely, outcast, despised of our brethren, hated of our brethren, and so on. I know a little bit about what that's like to be rejected in some ways by someone. And I didn't at 17 or 18. I'd gone from success to success. Heck, I was student body president at my high school and things like that. So, later on you read it and you think, no, life is not always easy. I mean, I remember when I was sealed in the temple, the sealer said, now you'll come across trials and tests and so on, and you need to cling to each other and cling to the Lord and so on. But I'm thinking in my heart, arrogantly enough, I've led a pretty charmed life. I mean, other people may run into difficulties, but I'm not going to. Well, then they hit you, and then you think, oh, yeah, nobody gets out of here without something difficult. And so, passages on that sort of theme now will hit me in a way that they didn't when I was just thinking, yeah, I'm the Lord's chosen, I'm going to get a good degree, I'll get a good job, I'm always going to be happy, live to a ripe old age. And none of that's going to happen to me. Then you get hit with something you did not see coming.
Any that you feel comfortable sharing?
Well, I've had some losses. We lost a granddaughter, our first granddaughter. We went out to Florida to be there for the birth, the happy event. We knew there were some difficulties with the pregnancy, but I got there just in time to learn that she wasn't going to make it. And so instead of being there happy for, the events surrounding a new baby, I ended up presiding over a small funeral at the cemetery. I remember thinking when I saw my children, my son and his wife, go into the room to say goodbye to their daughter for the last time. They were going to basically pull the plug. And I thought, for the first time in my life, I've heard the phrase, I wish it were me instead of you. I really felt that then. I thought, I know what that means, because watching them and knowing there was nothing I could do, I tried to be comforting, but I couldn't spare them. I would much rather it had been me that suffered that. And, but you see these difficult things. My father, his last several years, he was in excellent health, very active, doing work in his garden and getting into family history research, which he loved, and following the stock market, which he enjoyed doing, and things like that. Very active mentally and physically. And then he went in to have work done on a problem in one of his veins, and something went wrong. There's no history of this in my family, but he had a stroke, and he lost his eyesight. So his last 7 or 8 years, he was blind.
7 or 8 years.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I'd never seen anything like that coming, and that was devastating. It was devastating to me and to him, obviously, but I remember, again, I'm this unemotional Scandinavian. I inherited that from my dad, but I remember bearing testimony when I was a bishop to my ward, and the thing had just happened with my father, and I lost it. And I bore, I think, a powerful testimony. I said, if I did not have the hope that someday he would see again, not in this life, not going to happen, but someday, this is not the end. This is not the final chapter of his story. I don't know how that I could handle it. But that is what gives me hope, that everything will be all right. And he'll look back at it as just kind of a blip. I mean, it was a difficult thing, but he would ask me sometimes, do you think I'll ever see again? And I would say yes, but I thought, no, not in this life. It's not a little thing with your eye that a surgeon can fix. It's a part of your brain that's died. The visual center is gone. And it's not going to come back barring some unthinkable miracle, which it doesn't seem to be in the cards. But, you've had things like that happen that where you think, oh man, I just remember hearing about other people's parents, and they were declining. My dad was vigorous, up to almost 90, and
90.
and then,
Wow.
Gone. And so you realize, no, everybody will face a test, and
Everybody.
and don't feel too secure, because it may come in a way you can't even imagine. And you can't prepare for it except by the general things of being faithful and prayerful and so on. But when it comes, it may be something you never saw. I didn't see my father being unable to move around in his last 7 years, but there it was. And so, yeah, my parents, their last few years were not very pleasant years. They both went downhill physically in ways that they'd been very vigorous and active and so on up till then. And then I thought it'd just go that way until the Lord touched them with his finger and they'd sleep, and that would be it. But not so.
Well, what you're revealing to me is this, in this microscope. If I look at it's way more messier.
Oh yeah.
There's way more detail. There's
Yeah.
way more things.
Yeah.
And if it takes that instead of the myopic, right? The the macro, right? The macro perspective,
Yeah.
the bigger picture is the only way to really get through it. Perhaps somebody's trial is the topic of Brigham Young. Perhaps
Yeah.
somebody's trial is their parents losing their sight,
Yeah.
whatever it may be. What of those? I have two questions that I want to do to maybe get us to some conclusion. You can add anything else you
Yeah.
want as well. But who have you learned is Brigham? Who had he's become, and then for you,
Yeah.
what of these? Once you go into the details, once you get into the specifics, who have you become?
Who is Brigham? Brigham is a great leader, a flawed man, but that's true, as I say, of absolutely everyone save one. So I think that's trivial. Is he flawed? Yeah, of course he is. So is President Oaks. I doubt that he would deny it. So was President Nelson. So was Joseph Smith. They all are and were. So was Peter. But he was a great man. He was a good man. He was devoted in a way to the gospel that I think is admirable, that we can admire and try to emulate. He said, this is one of his sayings. He said, I thought back then, before I joined the church, he says, that if I could just meet a prophet, a man who spoke with God, who received revelation, he said, I would circumnavigate the globe on my hands and knees to meet him. Well, in Joseph Smith, he believed he'd found that man. And once he realized that, he was all in. One thing that I'd like to say about Brigham that I learned that I think is important is that he was a spiritual man. Again, I grew up with this notion of Brigham as organizational genius, colonizer, practical man who could set out settlements and lay out roads and all that kind of thing. Really good. The kind of guy you'd want on your side, a kind of natural-born engineer and MBA or something. But was there a spiritual side to him? Well, not much. Well, I've learned since then that he claimed revelation on more occasions than I had realized, and believed that he'd received it. But more than that, we have a scene in the opening scene in 6 Days in August, or very near the opening, shows Brigham Young speaking to an ox. These oxen are mired in the mud and they refuse to move, and they're blocking the road. So Brigham gets out of the carriage he's in and comes over to them and begins to speak to them in tongues.
What?
And people have said to me on numerous occasions, "You made that up." No, we didn't. That is in the historical documents. It actually happened. Yeah.
People just never heard of that story.
No. And the oxen, there are two of them, get up and they move. And the other people are going, "Who is this man that he talks to oxen?" And they seem to obey him. He soothes them and motivates them. And that's where we introduce the character. It's Wilford Woodruff, I think, who turns to the stranger and says, "That, my friend, is Brigham Young." Now, that's really early in his life, in the 1830s probably. But then Joseph, he goes to meet Joseph. And it's kind of a funny experience because he's lost his first wife. He's despondent. And Heber and some others think, well, maybe it would help him. He's joined the church. But he needs to meet the prophet. And so they take him to visit Joseph Smith. While he's there, he speaks in tongues again. And this again is documented. People say, "You made that up." No, we did not. But we showed it for a very specific reason. We wanted people to understand that Brigham was not just the organizational genius and the colonizer and the man of affairs. Brigham Young was the first one to speak in tongues in front of Joseph Smith. And Sidney Rigdon, this is interesting, Sidney objected. Says, "Gibberish, nonsense. This is not a gift from God." And they said, "Well, what do you think, Joseph?" And Joseph says, "It is from God." And by the way, we don't show it in the scene, but apparently, I think it's on that occasion that Brigham goes out of the room for something, and Joseph says, "That man will succeed me in the leadership of the church." That's heard by at least two different people. Heber C. Kimball and Joseph Young, I think, were in the room, and they said that Joseph said that. Which is really interesting. That's on their first meeting that Joseph recognized there's something unusual about this man, and I think that's important to note. But I one of the points that I'm trying to make, or that we're trying to make with this Becoming Brigham series, is that Brigham was a spiritual man. It was all about the kingdom for him, and he did believe that he was in contact with the Lord. One of the comments he makes is when they're debating leadership of the church, he says, "We have the oracles. We know how to get the will of God." And he's making a claim on behalf of the 12 that they have the right, they have the keys, and frankly, Sidney does not. Nor does anybody else out there who's claiming it. We are the ones the Lord has chosen. And that is an important point to understand. Now, how have I changed? I've become more confident of Brigham's role as successor to Joseph. And our story in 6 Days in August isn't only about Brigham. He was the leader of the 12. It was the 12 who were succeeding to the leadership of the church with Brigham at their head. Now, people ask me, I remember just recently when President Nelson died, they said, "Well, who is the president of the church? Who will be the president of the church?" And my answer would be, as I think any informed Latter-day Saint would say, Dallin H. Oaks is president of the church, and he was within a split second of the death of Russell Nelson. He happens to be president of the Quorum of the 12, but the Quorum of the 12 is the presiding quorum of the church now, and he presides over them. So he is the president of the church. There is not a second where there is no president. And
a lot of people don't realize that.
No, but that was established in 1844. People didn't understand. They'd never had a succession crisis before. Who succeeds? Well, Sidney's still there from the first presidency. So he actually had an argument he could make, but it actually is the 12. And we now understand that, but they didn't then. But Brigham, it said that he was worried when he first heard the news that Joseph had died. He was very upset personally. But he also said he wondered what happened to the keys. And then he said, then I slapped my knee and realized they're here with us. That's what Joseph was doing. He held a meeting with them and rolled off the kingdom onto their shoulders and gave them the keys. They must have wondered, what's this about? I think for them, it was a little bit like for the ancient apostles. They couldn't conceive of Jesus not being there, even though he told them over and over and over again, I'm going to be departing. They weren't really listening, and they heard it, but they didn't hear it.
Because of what it meant for them.
Yeah. I mean, he's such a powerful personality that, he's never going to be gone. He's so vivid. Joseph Smith was that way too. And so the 12 were confident, this will go on forever, Oh yeah, he's rolling the keys off on us. And he's saying things, should have given it away. The Lord is going to let me rest for a little while. You need to bear up the kingdom and bear it off like men, and so on and so forth. I think if they were listening, they would have said, whoa, this is worrying. But they weren't listening, and I can't blame them. They look up to him so much, and then suddenly find yourself without him. My brother told me once that the time when his testimony, after he got active in the church, the time when his testimony flagged the most was when he was called as a bishop. And he said the reason was that he'd always looked up to bishops.
Oh, yeah.
And suddenly, no, me? Seriously, me? But I wrote the lesson for my old Gospel Doctrine Writing Committee on first chapters of when Joshua takes over from Moses.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things you notice there is repeatedly the people say to Moses, or to Joshua, and God finally says to Joshua, be strong and of good courage. It's repeated about 5 times. And I think, why? Well, because put yourself in Joshua's place. He'd been the faithful lieutenant to Moses, this powerful, powerful prophet. Suddenly Moses is gone, and you're thinking, okay, I was good at second in command, but me?
The weight.
Now I'm in charge? And that's why the people and the Lord have to tell him, Joshua, you're going to be okay. Be strong and of good courage. And it just keeps repeating those early chapters. I think I can understand that as a human, having now occasionally been put in a position where I thought, I'm not ready for this. And then suddenly you are. I've heard that Heber J. Grant said once, I've never seen it in print, he said, if you ever think you're ready for a calling, you're not.
yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
It's true. You're not ready to be a parent. You're not ready to, and most things. And that's the point.
Yeah.
That's the point.
And we're all improvising. And that's another thing that I've learned is as you get older, you realize everybody is in a position where he thinks, me? To be called to the 12. Do I dare say this? Maybe you don't want to include it, but I was up in the church office building when Elder Bednar was called to the Quorum of the 12. I mean, a few days after. And I was on what was called the Middle East Advisory Committee. And we'd go up there and meet because general authorities were in town and we'd meet with them. After our meeting, I come out in the hallway and here's Elder Bednar and his wife. He's just been called to the 12 the previous weekend. This is Tuesday or something. And the person I was with knew his wife. And so they began to talk. And I'm just standing there with Elder Bednar. And I don't know what to say to a new member of the Quorum of the 12 whom I've never met before. And I said, well, how are you doing? He said, I feel like a deer caught in the headlights. And I thought, I bet there are a lot of people who've been called to those sorts of positions who feel just that way. It's one thing to honor and respect members of the Quorum of the 12. It's another to be there or to be a bishop, or a stake president or something where you think, I don't know what I'm doing.
To be a parent. I mean, it's like,
yes, exactly.
It's like, oh, this is there's no turning back.
Yeah. My parents were all wise. They surely knew what they were doing. Now I look back and I think, I bet there were times when they were as clueless as I have been, where they're thinking, what do I do?
Well, back to that experience.
Yeah.
Right? And the experience matters. And if you knew everything, then what's the point?
Yeah. But you have to be a parent to know that. And so, again, experience is all important. And that's why the Lord sent us here, to get experience.
This is powerful. Anything else?
I probably ought to shut up.
No, this is good. Well, this has been a pleasure. I mean, there's so many things we could have gone into and could have talked about, but I believe, and I know that what you said is true. And what I like to say to everyone out there in the world is up to you to find out for yourself. This is Stephen Jones. This is Let's Get Real. Until next time.